What shocking secret made you see someone completely differently? There's an engineering professional at my workplace that likes to wear pricey articles of clothing. He even sports a Breitling wristwatch, and those things are priced from around $3,000 to over $17,000 as his work timepiece. Turns out that he and his wife are buried beneath a mountain of credit card debt, and while I don't look down my nose at him, I definitely view his attire and accessories a little differently knowing that fact. There was this one girl I'd known for a long time but wasn't massively close to, who we all thought was being terribly controlled by her boyfriend. She'd tell us that he decided when she was allowed to drink, when she was allowed to go out, what she was allowed to do, stuff like that, and that he'd started to impose bedtimes for her and shout at her over what seemed like extremely minor things. We all thought he was awful and we encouraged her to leave. Then she moved in with me and I realized she was extremely emotionally unstable and an alcoholic. Within months, I found myself wanting to do, or in some cases actually doing, all the things she'd said her controlling boyfriend had done. I remember one time, after trying to remain patient with her for a while, she said one thing that was relatively minor and it was just the last straw for me. I snapped and screamed at her. I then got phone calls from our mutual friends to talk about my behavior and anger management, presumably as a result of the story being told back to them in a somewhat biased way. So in a way, her secret changed my opinion of him. I should say that I still know he was no saint. He was very far from it. In fact, for instance, he had been pretty violent in their time together, and this was corroborated by others. There were plenty of times I got so angry I felt like raising a hand to her, and I had to walk away to calm down. There's never an excuse to actually hit someone. I guess what I'd say now is that they're both pretty terrible, but I had a much less black and white view of both of them after getting to know her better. In my early days as a lawyer, I represented a sweet old widower with Parkinson's disease who was being sued by a local store for groceries that his late wife had purchased on credit without ever paying for them. I felt awful for him. And then shortly before the trial, I found out he'd done jail time for very inappropriate conduct around minors. My wife's bestie confided in us that while short on money, she was moonlighting as a professional woman who went into people's houses with leather and tools to give them services that were not readily available elsewhere. The word sounds like domino matrix. Until then, we'd thought she was just super vanilla. Hi there, audience. Why yes, I did work way too hard trying to find a way to describe this woman's services that wouldn't get demonetized. Thank you for noticing. On with the video. A friend I grew up with started dating a guy and quickly got pergananant, and married at 25 or so. One night, hanging out with her and her husband, he was like, "Did she ever tell you how we met?" Apparently, she was a working girl from right after she turned 18. He was one of her Johns, but they took a liking to one another. They've since gotten divorced. I had a seemingly innocent friend who normally kept to herself about her issues. Then one day she told us that she couldn't tell if she had a sore throat because she was sick or because she swallowed too much splooge the other night. That was the only thing I associated her name with afterwards. My uncle forced my dying granddad to sell over the family beach house for a very low price. He's now a millionaire. He created a surf school on the property, which he then went on to sell, then buying a backpackers, which has become pretty successful. Now here's a positive one. My wife, a defense attorney, has a work colleague who's the biggest butthole you'll ever meet. A blowhard who revels in winning at any cost and brags about the snarky things he does to really twist the knife. He's known as a sharp legal mind, but I get the sense he likes to try to screw weaker ADAs or other counselors and loves it when he catches them on some technicality. He makes these stereotypes about lawyers seem valid. My church had a sort of Habitat for Humanity-esque service weekend where we were rehabbing an old warehouse into a new space as a temporary women's shelter for battered women. The offices were already up, but the individual rooms needed to be refloored, the bathrooms retiled, sheetrock needed to be hung and primed, and to my surprise, I saw the butthole there with a tool belt helping to install a sink. Long story short, he donates his legal services to that one shelter, helping to set up restraining orders, divorces, custody, stuff like that, for women trying to get away from their violent partners or bad families. At first, I wondered if this was some kind of court-ordered community service. It wouldn't surprise me if he'd done something to deserve it and then teed off a judge somewhere. But no, the coordinator for the shelter who was working with my church says that he'd been doing that for the past few years. Apparently, his wife's previous husband was a truly awful man, and he has a real heart for people in that situation. I don't know if that's really a secret, but my wife didn't know about it and didn't believe me when I told her. He obviously doesn't brag about it, which is something I thought he'd totally do. In short, butthole attorney actually has a heart. The local park homeless alcoholic was once a professor of ancient history and dead languages and could speak and write in languages many of us would never even see. He used to teach at Trinity College until he was convicted for his wife's death. How she died or if he did it is a mystery to me, but one person I've spoken to reckons it was an accident, and another says they don't think he did it. Made me see the reality that no matter who you are, you could end up in a personal hell. It only slightly changed my perception, but I was about 9 or 10 when my dad told me why he and my mum split up. His exact words in a sad tone were, she was seeing another man. He wouldn't tell me who it was. From now on, every time an affair is mentioned, I give a quick glance to my mum. She still doesn't know I know. I had a work friend back in the day. His wife was really mean to him. She always would tell me his kids hate him, even though they'd run to the door excited when their daddy was home, and when she was really mad at him, she'd flip out and say that he'd done the deed with his sister, and also a pig. He'd just ignore her and not say anything back. Now, I just ignored it because she'd always try and make him look bad when she was mad at him. Well, one night we were drinking, and he was pretty drunk. His wife got mad too and did it again, but this time the heated exchange went like this. You effed your sister and you effed a pig once. Long pause. You know what? Frick you. That stuff happened like 3 years ago. You need to just drop it and move on. I don't deserve to have it rubbed in my face all the time. Then I realized why she held such resentment towards him, and I noped the F on out of there and never talked to them again. I feel so bad for their kids. It was a really dysfunctional situation for them. Luckily, I heard they aren't together anymore. There was a guy I worked with that was kinda handsy but generally nice all the time. I learned he was gay but in the closet. It was then that I started noticing how he treated everyone else. Kinda like a D-bag. He wasn't handsy with anyone else, so all the positive attention was him trying to flirt, I guess? He wasn't very good at it. I had a conversation with him when he asked me to lunch. I had to awkwardly explain that I'm married. I feel like I might have accidentally led him on. I felt a little bad about it, but I wore my ring every day and I've got pictures of my family on my desk. We're still on friendly terms and I introduced him to my circle of gay bro friends to help him acclimate to the culture. We became decent enough friends, but a lot of the flirt-like behavior stopped. I found out my best friend was an attempted unspeakable act offender and bragged about it to everyone but me. Also found out he held a weapon to one of his ex's throats. There are many more things, but finding this out after a decade-long friendship, I ended it abruptly. I knew he was a narcissist when I first met him, just would never have guessed the rabbit hole went as far as it did. Unfortunately, he took our circle of friends with him. He was exceptionally charismatic. That my friend from middle school was in the witness protection program and his last name was fake. I read that as his last name was fake and immediately thought, why the hell would they draw attention to it by making his last name fake? Hi, I'm Michael Fake. I guess I'm just not running on all cylinders tonight. My grandma cheated on my grandpa when he was in the war. One of her kids isn't his. Everyone knows, but nobody talks about it. As a kid, I used to spend a lot of time playing computer games with my neighbor. One day I caught him pressing the caps lock key each time he wanted to capitalize a letter. I told him the shift key did the same job, which led to a 15-minute tirade about how the caps lock button was better. We've drifted apart since then. That is one hell of a hill to die on. And if anyone says anything to the contrary, I swear I will cut you out of my life and burn your house down. Don't oppose me on this. Don't do it! I had a guy in my D&D gaming group with a smokin' redheaded girlfriend. All of us thought the redhead was gorgeous, but you know, guy code. Until it was revealed that the slightly annoying but tolerated power gamer of the group made it clear that he thought he was next in line to date the redhead if guy number 1 left the picture. It utterly destroyed our gaming group. Redhead thought that it was hilarious in a sad, cringe kind of way, and hurt his feelings. And I personally, as the dungeon master, was aghast that human being's mind could operate that way. Like, dude, she's not a frickin' carnival prize. I couldn't stand to play or even speak to him anymore, but it was pretty clear he wasn't coming back anyway. Good riddance. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to Am I the Genius? I just found out that 8 years ago, my wife, a teacher, started an affair with an 18-year-old student of hers. We had been together for 10 years and married for 4 at that point. We had a 4-month-old daughter at the time and she threw it all away. Career, marriage, and family. I had no idea anything was wrong until 5 days beforehand when I found her crying in bed and she told me she was depressed, no longer in love with me, and no longer wanted to be alive, mostly because of my drinking habits. I took sole responsibility. I swore off drinking and I had us signed up for marriage counseling the same day, plus got her in contact with a postpartum depression group. 6 days later, she's sent into a crisis center by her school, and I found out everything after the psychiatrist there makes her tell me the truth when I show up to bring her home. For those curious about how that story developed, here's a very condensed update. My ex and I tried marriage counseling for a few months, but ultimately the affair wasn't something we could get past. She was actually still in contact with the student during this time, and they even tried dating for a while. It didn't last. At the end of it all, I've learned a lot. I've grown a lot and changed a lot. Anyone who's been cheated on will tell you that it changes you, and that's true. My new wife has been a godsend. She helped me through the divorce with more patience and grace than you can reasonably expect from anyone. We blended our families. She had a very similar story to mine, actually. And despite all the craziness in the world that began in 2019, we've really thrived together. There was a woman who I considered my friend for many, many years. She had cancer, survived it, but it was still there and created many problems. She even appeared on TV shows as an advocate for cancer patients. She did a lot of political activism and was very much opposed to euthanasia. Published some books. Then one day, through a series of coincidences, it turned out that her cancer had never existed. She'd completely made it up. A big, fat, whopping lie. I'd feel ashamed because I fell for it for so long, except that a lot of other people fell for it too, including professionals. Doctors, nurses, and priests. Needless to say, it ended that friendship. And it made me think a lot about how easily fooled we all are. Oh, and by the way, she's passed away by now. Of cancer. I'm not kidding. Not the cancer she had made up, of course. Karma can be such a witch. I had a friend who hung out with two friends who were girls, and he was male. All went well, according to him, but the girls told me he said, "It's getting hot," and proceeded to take off his shirt and then just crank it and finish into a cup, got all sweaty and then just left. I could not look that man in the eye ever again, and I cut off all contact. There was this guy in my high school who was the typical big meathead football player bully. Picking fights, playing mean-spirited pranks, super homophobic and misogynistic. He was something straight out of a teen movie. My senior year, he ended up in my English class. At the end of that year, we had to do senior statements, which were basically speeches where you talk about a very painful or life-changing event that you've been through. He got up and began to tell a heart-wrenching story about how he and his brother had been subjected to some awful treatment by his father since they were kids. He hates football and wishes he could do drama like he wants to, but his father would never allow it. He acknowledged what a butthole he was and was besides himself for not knowing how to treat others. He then quietly went back to his seat where he proceeded to cry quietly for the remainder of the class. His story radically changed my opinion of him. He was the first person who made me realize that most people do deserve compassion. He still lives in my hometown, and occasionally I find him at the bar downtown. He's a good guy, much quieter now, but hopefully pursuing something he loves because he deserves the happiness. My old man used to hang nooses in the garage when I was very small as a way to manipulate my mother into staying with him. He was implying he was ready to self-delete if she broke up. This is as far back as 1990. She finally left him more than a decade ago. When I found out how awful he'd been to her all this time, I could never look at him the same way. He didn't end things, by the way. In high school, I learned my best friend would contact most of the female friends I had, generally after I'd had a falling out or just some confrontation with them, and then pester them with, amongst other things, his overpowering obsession with their feet. I learned this in senior year when I started reconnecting with some of these friends, and all of them had the same story. I haven't spoken to him since. My boyfriend, years ago, told me he was subjected to some pretty inappropriate behavior by his gay uncle, his actual uncle's partner. Yet, my boyfriend continued to see him at family gatherings because he didn't want it to affect the family and had to be nice. A few months after he told me, he got drunk and in an argument with his dad and yelled it so that everyone could hear. He and I broke up not long after that. Last I heard, his dad was looking for blood, and the ex-uncle was in jail. I had an ex. He was one of those, "I'm so gentle and kind, ooh, I love pastel colors and flower crowns, ooh," types, who went on a date with a friend of mine. This friend goes on to tell me they broke up because he admitted to getting it on with his dog on multiple occasions and asked my friend if they wanted to watch him reenact that exact activity on a Skype call. I was like, holy hell, dude, I just broke up with him because he was frickin' annoying. Well, learning that my partner did the deed with animals would annoy me, so I'd say that you could have said that regardless of which of those two ended up being a deal breaker for you. I hope you reported him to, someone? I don't know, did the cops come for a call like that? Not necessarily a secret, but I was 8 years old, it was Christmas, and our family was over at a friend's acreage for Christmas Eve. I was sitting on my dad's lap, and I placed my hand up against his to compare size, and to my utter shock and horror, I noticed my dad was missing a finger. His pinky finger. My mum and dad were confused. You never noticed that? He's been missing his finger your entire life. No, I hadn't ever noticed it. It was actually a bit too much to handle for an 8-year-old at the time. I was absolutely devastated. In actuality, he lost his thumb while working on the oil rigs, and they transplanted his pinky finger to where his thumb would be so that he still had some sort of grasping abilities. Pretty cool, but it freaked me out so badly as a kid. My friend in high school went to jail shortly after graduation for committing the unspeakable act on and then physically attacking his on and off again girlfriend to within an inch of her life. Turns out it wasn't the first time either, or the first girl that he'd done that to. We're quite open about stuff in our family, so I've learned a lot of weird stuff about my father and my stepmother. But I think maybe the highlight was when my stepmother casually joked about my father's thing for MTV's Geordie or Jersey Shore. Apparently, my dad watches the show when he can't sleep, all alone in the night. I have a friend who gets in the mood for the deed by the idea of inflicting pain on those who they feel have earned it. I guess a literal rager for justice. Someone I knew told me that predators are discriminated against in today's society, and we should just change the laws around such matters. Complete game changer. My stepbrother stole my parents' identity, opened up credit cards and maxed them out. When my parents found out, they didn't prosecute because he'd end up going to jail. They paid the credit cards off by making a settlement with the bank. If he shows up at Thanksgiving to my mum's house, my dad is deceased, it's gonna be dramatic. Brother's best friend and best man at my wedding. All of a sudden moved to Washington about a year and a half ago. We have no ties there, and neither does he, and we just couldn't figure it out, but whatever, maybe he wants a new start. Then all of a sudden he moves back to the town my parents lived in. Last Thanksgiving, the US Marshals showed up to take him into custody and to send him back to Washington. He's facing trial next month for illegal conduct with a younger person amongst many other charges. Definitely has changed the way I look at him. I have a guy friend who's always been quite popular with the ladies, despite being an average-looking guy. We lost touch for a few years, but within 24 hours of reconnecting again, he told me that he secretly meets guys on dating apps, hires male and trans escorts, and absolutely loves cross-dressing. Now, the only time we ever really speak is when he wants my opinion on some underwear or toys. I definitely feel special for being his go-to secret keeper, but he really has no filter with me anymore, and I often get more info than I want or need to know. Sibling set of cousins, my third cousins. They're 2 sisters and a brother. The youngest sister, she's 31 this year, and this happened in about 2009, was dating a mixed-race guy who had one parent black and the other white. I didn't realize how racist her family was. They told her to leave him immediately, and when they found out she had not only not left him, but was also now having normal, consenting adult relations with him, her siblings attacked her while their father watched, and they forced her onto a plane to the EU the next day, black eye and all. Had her personal documents seized by her sister and was basically a prisoner there. I found out about a year later when our other cousin told me. I can never look at anyone in that family the same way, and it's so sad because as a kid I was really fond of them. The older sister had a coffee shop which my dad used to take us to a lot, and I think that's where he met my stepmom. I'm not sure if this is a secret now since my mum knows and I didn't tell her. Though at the time my cousin asked me to keep it quiet because it was top secret and very sensitive information. I don't know if any of the family know that I know about this as well. If any of them ever reads this, you guys suck. I met a friend's new boyfriend who told me that he had spent time in jail for 2 DUIs. He got a DUI, and then he got another one, and the judge gave him jail time. He drank a lot, but when I met him he was at least very careful about not driving. But to be honest, I did judge him for it. Pretty crappy to drive drunk. And how do you get 1 DUI and then not learn your lesson? It was something that affected the way I saw him. Fast forward 3 years and he's now married to my friend. One night I'm out with my friend and she makes a comment about his sister. I'd heard he had a sister who died, but I never knew the details. Turns out she was the victim of a violent revenge by an ex-boyfriend, and my friend's husband is the one who found her afterwards. Walking into the house, coming home from college for summer break, and he found her in a pretty awful state. The DUIs were in that first 6 months after her death. Should he have been driving drunk? No, of course not. But after I learned that, I had so much compassion for him and the terrible pain he must have been going through. People deal with such terrible things, and they don't always deal with them well. What happened when a cop realized, "Oh, I think we caught the wrong guy"? Oh, I've got two, from 25 years ago when I was a cop. One on one side of the badge and one from the other. The first, I got assigned a warrant service to pick up a wanted felon. Mr. Robertson was 6 foot tall, 250 pounds, bushy red beard, and lived at, let's say, 123 Elm Street. Pretty distinctive dude. So I rolled up to 123 Elm Street, and sure enough, there mowing his lawn in the front yard is the man himself. 6 foot, 250 pounds, red hair, red beard. I made contact with him. Hey, Mr. Robertson, you got warrants and it's time to go to jail. Hook him up, take him to jail, and in central booking I get his property off him, and while filling out the inventory, I happen to notice this guy is Mr. Robinson, not Robertson. Sure enough, the wanted guy was this guy's landlord and his twin brother from another mother doppelganger. When I'd said Robertson, Robinson didn't even twig the fact that I hadn't said his name. He just heard the familiar-sounding name as his own one. We had to walk the whole thing back and reactivate the warrant, then kicked him loose with a handshake and an apology. The one from the other side had just gotten off duty at 2 a.m. and was driving home still in my uniform. There wasn't any other traffic on the road, so I wasn't really surprised when a police car turned in behind me and started following me. I figured he was trolling for drunks and I was the only thing moving on the road, so he was just going to follow me a little to observe my driving, and he'd realize pretty quick that I was sober and peel off. Instead, another patrol car joined him, and another, and another. Then all four lit me up and spread out behind me, blocking the road in a full felony stop. Well, this just got interesting. They went through the whole procedure and I carefully followed their instructions. When they finally got me out and saw my uniform, they just stopped for a few seconds while I was trying to figure out just what the heck was going on. Then 3 of the officers got in their cars, turned off their lights and took off, while the original officer told me I could put my hands down and explained what was going on. Turns out my car was a spot-on match for the suspect vehicle in an armed robbery and shooting that had just occurred right up the road. I'd driven right by the scene before the cops even got there a few minutes before the officer in the next district spotted me and thought I was the suspect. It was an interesting night. In our family, we had a great uncle who tattooed his name and social security number to his shoulder. Apparently he had the same name and birthday as another guy with a prison record, and had kept hearing about it. It came in handy at least twice when he was pulled over and the cops started arresting him. Each time he got out because he had his social security as proof that he was innocent. Note to self: tattoo my American doppelganger's social security number on my shoulder. Step 2, become serial bank robber in the States. Step 3, profit. Kinda makes you wonder if anyone realized what number they were looking at when this guy went to the beach or something. 2 of my colleagues, who were murder squad detectives, attended custody to meet a defendant answering bail. When they arrived at the custody desk, there were a couple of people hanging around waiting for their solicitors. They gave the custody sergeant the name that they were there for, and he pointed one of the guys out. They went up and introduced himself and said that they'd be questioning him at another station, so all 3 got in the car and headed out. Whilst driving, they told the defendant what would be happening. On arrival, he'd be arrested on suspicion of attempted murder, questioned and either bailed or remanded. The guy was like, "You've got to be joking. Attempted murder? I was shoplifting." He was relatively calm, half laughing and shaking his head. A short time later, one of the officers got a call from the custody sergeant. Their actual bail appointment had arrived. There were 2 defendants with the same name answering bail that day. They apologized to the non-murderous shoplifter, turned the car around and headed back to bring down the right person for questioning. Keystone Cops to the max. I was actually the wrong person in question. There was another man 2 years younger than me who shares my first and last name, exact same spelling, the only difference is the middle name. Police were investigating a county trustee who was giving people housing assistance checks that they didn't qualify for. They'd cash the assistance and give the trustee a percentage back. One of the civilians being investigated was the other guy. A plainclothes cop in an unmarked car shows up with a female holding a clipboard, identifies herself as a state trooper, and within 5 minutes is asking me for copies of my bank records. He's threatening to subpoena if I don't comply. This isn't the first time I've been mistaken for this guy. I used to get his mail all the time, and I even asked them if they were looking for me or the other guy, pointing out our different middle names. I got really suspicious really fast. It was a high-pressure situation demanding access to my financial records, threats to subpoena and further legal action. So I was starting to doubt whether this was an actual police officer or was in fact just a scammer. The badge he showed me was just a plastic square like my driver's license, further muddying the issue. I told him I wanted to speak with the police and called dispatch. 2 uniformed officers showed up 15 minutes later and confirmed the guy was an officer. The woman with him was some kind of auditor and record keeper. After a further 15 minutes of questions, the woman pulled the guy away and pointed out something on her phone. Yep, they wanted the other guy. I live in a neighborhood in Indiana that's going through a major revitalization right now, so it's very much in a transitional phase. We rent from a good friend of ours. He bought the house from some garbage people who'd lived there a long time ago. These people sold and made various illegal substances. There was violence, working girls, everything. In general, the house was disgusting, unlivable really, just the worst. Well, the scumbags who lived there still try to use our address even after 5 years. About a year and a half ago, one of the guys used our address to renew his driver's license at the DMV. He even had the audacity to leave a note for us to call him when the license came in. Fast forward a few months, around Christmas time, we're all sitting around watching TV when we get a knock at the door. My husband answers it, and it's a SWAT team with weapons hot. They see my husband, who doesn't look like a crystal user or smackhead, and inside are our 2 little boys, my parents, and me nursing our baby, plus the Christmas tree and all the lovely trappings of our home. They immediately put their MP5s down, and my husband and I have a lovely chat with them. Yeah, they had our house surrounded, weapons-free, the whole shebang, looking for this one guy who was wanted on some kind of violent felony. We were angry at this guy, who I refer to as Big Nasty. Oh, this one guy who definitely went through some crap being the wrong person. A Missouri man spent nearly 17 years behind bars for robbery until his doppelganger was discovered. The other guy looked so much like him that authorities decided to toss out his conviction. Jones, who was 41, had been serving a 19-year jail sentence for a 1999 robbery when he heard other inmates buzzing that another prisoner looked just like him and even shared his first name, Starr said. It's unclear what the other person was locked up for, and Jones never saw his doppelganger. But he told 2 legal interns assigned to his case about the rumors, according to Alice Craig, one of Jones' lawyers. The interns brought the message back to their superiors at Midwest Innocence Project and the Paulie Wilson Defender Project, who dug further into the case. It turned out that not only did the other man bear an uncanny resemblance to Jones, he also lived closer to the site of the crime. Jones's doppelganger, Ricky Amos, used to live with his mother in Kansas City, Kansas, near the address of the incident, Craig said. Jones lived across the state line in Kansas City, Montana. When I saw that picture, it made sense to me, said Jones, who's denied committing the robbery to the Star. Either you're going to think we're the same person or you're going to be like, man, these guys, they look so much alike. His lawyers showed the 2 men's photos to the victim, 2 witnesses, and the prosecutor in Jones's case, and all 4 admitted they couldn't tell the pair apart, according to the Star. Okay, the narrator did a bit of digging and found out that thankfully the innocent man in question was awarded $1.1 million in damages. I'm not sure that makes up for 17 years in prison or how much went to his lawyers in the end, but I'm glad at least he got something resembling an amount that he could maybe begin rebuilding his life with. My mum had a story like this happen to her. Basically, it revolves around the show America's Most Wanted. A woman who looked almost exactly like my mum was featured on the show. She had the same hair, same face, and the kicker, the same name. They even showed my mum's actual information, which I won't list here as being the criminals. The story ended like every story on that show does. If you have any information regarding the whereabouts of this dangerous criminal, please call this number. Now, on to my mum's perspective. She was just sitting at home on a Saturday night alone, as she lived alone. She was reading a Stephen King book when she hears some commotion coming from the hallway. She ignores it. Lots of yelling. She hadn't seen the show, which painted her as a criminal. Then suddenly, bam! Her door is knocked down in an instant. About 10 cops flood into her 1-bedroom apartment and she's arrested. She explained that they had the wrong person. They claimed everything matched. Social security matched, DNA matched, name matched, photo resemblance matched. It turns out the woman was basically stealing my mum's identity and intentionally making herself look like my mum. The end result is that when they created the profile for the criminal, they used my mum's information to start with. So, when they arrested my mum, of course the information matched. It was her information originally. They kept her in jail for 2 weeks. It wasn't until they took fingerprints from the scene of the crime that they said that she'd committed and the prints didn't match that they realized she wasn't the criminal. It's scary to think that if they'd used her profile prints, rather than crime scene prints as the set to compare to, that she'd still be in jail today. It was basically a life sentence for what the other lady did. I was 16 and worked at a golf course mowing lawns and such. We got a call at home from the cops that said I was a suspect in a hit-and-run accident because my plate numbers were on the car that drove away without stopping. The cops said that the car was maroon-colored. My car was grey. We told them and figured that was that. The next day at work, there was a minor accident. An idiot coworker pulled a metal rake too hard, and the rack holding it came down onto my forehead. It wasn't a deep wound, but it bled a lot, as head wounds are wont to do. My boss took me to the ER to get my head superglued and to be safe, took me home as well. Thus, my car stayed at the golf course. That evening, a cop came by and found me with my head wound and my car missing. I looked quite guilty. By sheer luck, the cop calls someone after talking to my parents and discovers they've got the guy and the plate numbers were just kinda close. I probably would have been arrested. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. The police stopped me once and asked me to get in the car because I fit the description of someone they were looking for, but they checked my ID and everything was cool. I asked them if they'd drop me home while I was in the car and said it'd be hilarious if they came to the front door with me to freak my mum out. She came to the door and as soon as she saw the police, her face was the angriest I've ever seen. It was hilarious. I was a curious little kid. My father stopped at the local liquor store to grab a bottle of wine and I was poking around. The door to the office was unlocked and I wandered inside, sat in the chair and spun around a few times, got bored and wandered out. A few days later, my father got a call from the police and we go in. As the officer was speaking to us, I proceeded to spin around in the chair and pick up and look at everything on his desk. After about a minute, the officer says, "Thank you for coming in. I see what happened. You can go." Turned out the owner's teenage son stole a few grand from the store and tried to blame it on the handsy 5-year-old. I did get felony stopped while on Las Vegas Boulevard. I left work, pulled out of the parking garage and turned right on Tropicana. I then saw lights behind me and started to pull over, thinking it was an emergency vehicle. I was then surrounded by police with weapons drawn. This was like midnight on the strip, so it was intense. The police made me get out and walk backwards with hands on my head. They cuff me and tear into my car almost immediately. Long story short, it was another Mustang with the out-of-state tags involved in a robbery. That was an intense evening. I was the wrong guy once. I was dating this girl and when things didn't work out, she got vindictive. She had a copy of my car insurance and got a guy friend to pose as me to call the police and report my vehicle stolen. I go beat-bopping out of work one glorious Friday afternoon and get felony stopped by about 10 Dallas, Texas police department officers. Guns drawn on me and everything, right outside of the large office complex I worked at. Turns out the people who reported my car stolen used their own phone number when filing the report and eventually got caught and charged. I travel frequently across the Canada-US border, sometimes by bus. On one bus trip, the whole bus was held up by one woman who was pulled back to be interrogated. An hour later, she got back on the bus, announcing there was a person on the most wanted list with the same name. However, that person was a 5'4" white male, and she was a relatively tall, probably 5'10", black woman. It took them an hour of interrogating her to realize they had the wrong person. You know, I never thought the police bias against people of color was so big that they'd make this obvious of an oversight, but there you go. Don't personal files and warrants usually have a description that they could go off? Wild. Once again, not a police officer, I was on the receiving end. I'd been at a small bar listening to some live music with a friend. We left a couple of hours later, and less than a mile from the bar, I got pulled over. No big deal. I pull into a circular driveway and then I got scared. No fewer than 4 police cars were surrounding us, 2 behind and 2 in front. They came to both sides and leave a number of officers at our windows while they run our licenses. See, earlier, in between sets, a lady got on stage and warned any women there not to walk home or accept rides from strangers. Apparently, there had been a number of abductions and unspeakable act offenses in the area. My friend and I ignored that warning. We weren't alone, and we were not women. Finally, the cops gave us our identification back and told us we matched the description of the offenders. Didn't say how they determined it wasn't us, but apologized and sent us on our way. It wasn't until the next day we realized just how bad that could have been. A few years ago, my husband and I were having a lazy Sunday morning, making pancakes, blasting music, having a good time. There was a really loud banging on the door. I rushed over to answer it, thinking someone must have knocked multiple times before we had even heard, and opened it up to 4 police officers who pushed into our kitchen. 2 of them grabbed my husband and started telling him that he's being placed under arrest for a hit-and-run accident that took place in a city almost 2 hours away. Freaking out, my husband explains to the police that he was at work all night and he's just got home an hour before that. He must have been really convincing because 2 officers sat at our kitchen table with us, while 2 others went outside to call my husband's workplace to confirm his story. Turns out a car that we'd sold about a year before that was involved in an accident that hit 3 parked cars and a woman the night prior. Luckily, she only had minor injuries. But the driver was nowhere to be found. There was a clear video of our old car smashing into parked cars, hitting a pedestrian and the man jumping out of it shortly afterwards. When the police found the abandoned car and ran the VIN, it led them to our house. In Ontario, when you sell a vehicle, you're supposed to bring a slip into the Service Ontario Centre to prove that the ownership has been transferred, but it's not really enforced and there's no penalties for not doing it, because the person purchasing the vehicle needs to do the same, to get plates, stickers and insurance, stuff like that. Obviously and stupidly, we didn't do the stuff on our end. The cops came back in, apologized for the mistake, gave us a half-hearted lecture about properly switching ownerships, and left. The jerk that was actually driving the car was caught the next day. An officer called my husband to tell him and made a joke about us having to pay any impound fees. I was the guy. Got pulled over a block from a local McDonald's. The officer explains that he got a report that the manager at McDonald's reported that a guy about my description had tried to grab the cash drawer from the register when she opened it to make a change for him. When she resisted, he fled in a yellow Ford LTD. I happened to be driving a Ford LTD. I told him I wasn't the guy, asked if the name of the manager who reported it was Tina. Yep. Well, then she would have told you my name when reporting the attempted robbery if I was the culprit. I'd been working there as a manager for about 2 years, and she'd definitely have recognized me. He agreed that I was unlikely to be the culprit. I immediately drove over to find out what had happened from Tina. Evidently, she had went on aggro when the guy tried to grab the door and just grabbed both his hands and dug her nails into the top of his hands. Evidently, it was all the guy could do to tear himself away and flee. Tina may have weighed about 100 pounds soaking wet. I'm in a class called Wildlife Law Enforcement, which is taught by a game warden. Wardens have police powers and can be called in if backup is needed. My teacher is a great guy and loves stories. Anyway, my local police force has a way of capturing people with outstanding warrants that may or not be common. What they do is send a letter to the perp saying that they won a prize from the city. Apparently, however they deliver this makes it seem very legit. To receive your prize, you have to go to the community center at a certain date and time, then the police get you to sign after you sign in for your prize. So in my city, they set this up and sent a letter to a particular man with a very recognizable name. The day of the prize claiming, this very large old man comes in and is soon fighting against 3 officers in this community center claiming. He fought pretty damn hard thinking he was being jumped, but of course got cuffed and stuffed in the back of a squad car. The issue? They didn't check the important details of age. They captured senior when junior was the one with the warrant. They assumed because of this man's very recognizable name that there could only be one. I remember when my son was 3 weeks old. It was 3 a.m. and I was laying down on the couch. Baby is in his rocker. Suddenly there's a loud knocking on my door followed by, "Police!" I thought for sure it was my friends coming home from the bar and they needed a place to crash, and they've done that police knock to me before. So I was just sitting there mad thinking, don't they know I have a kid now? Needless to say, I didn't answer the door, figured they'd find somewhere else. Next thing I know, my door was kicked down, I grabbed the baby and ran towards the door, and 4 or 5 police officers run in. They searched my house with flashlights, scared the crap out of my sleeping husband. My 5-year-old didn't wake up though. Turns out they had the wrong address. They apologized and a week later they installed a new door for me. But holy crap was that scary. There's something endlessly hilarious about a very serious and gung-ho police squad going into a house in action movie mode, then sheepishly having to walk out again apologizing. I know it must be super scary for the homeowner, but my goodness, it's a great second-hand thing to laugh about. One night around 8 p.m, my fiancé received a call. The officer calling said, "Derek, we have your health card. Tell us your whereabouts right now." My fiancé answered, "This isn't Derek." "You sound like Derek. Your buddies ratted you out and gave us your number. Now where are you?" "I'm not Derek and I'm not telling you where I am. Who are you?" "This is Officer Smith. Stop messing around and tell us your location, Derek." "Again, Derek is not my name. How do I know you're a real officer?" "Boy, if you don't tell me where you are, you're going to be in much more trouble. My badge number is," and gives a number. "Okay, fine, I'm at home at," and he gives our address. If you don't show up in a police car, I'm not coming out." He hung up the phone, dialed 911 because we live in a bad area and weren't sure if this was a fake call or not. The operator verifies it was a correct badge number. The officer called back. He apparently misdialed by one number. He apologized but still blamed my fiancé because "you were being very defensive and sounded guilty." This one sort of fits. I used to work an AWOL section in the army where we'd collect soldiers that were AWOL from various jails and process them. One time we got paperwork for a guy that was supposedly AWOL since the Korean War. Both me and the LA officers had no idea what to make of it. The guy was old, I don't remember exactly how old, and obviously the paperwork we had from his enlistment was outdated, and impossible to tell from the picture if it was him or not. I mean, it was 50 years prior. The person in custody was saying he was never in the army and that it was a mistaken identity. He was Korean, and his name, particularly his last name, was not at all that unique. I think Kim, Lee, and Park account for something like 60% of South Korean last names. Socials weren't used as ID numbers back then, so we couldn't use that. We ended up just letting him go because A, we had no way to tell if it was even the right guy or not, and B, we weren't going to send a 70-year-old guy to get dishonorable discharged. Still no idea if this was the right guy. Teachers, when did karmic justice finally come to that one troublesome student? Had one who was a real monster of a kid when I taught 5th. This kid, let's call him Ray, had one of those mums who refused to hold him accountable for anything. It was always some other kid did it, or Ray was just protecting himself, Ray just wanted to fit in, Ray was being targeted. Also, she was one of those mums who'd ask Ray if he were guilty and take his no as incontestable truth. She'd say, "My son doesn't lie to me." "Oh really? Your kid doesn't lie? So it's just your kid and Jesus." All kids lie, lady. Anyway, I had a full caseload as a special ed teacher, so I got a paraprofessional, let's call him Steve. Ray hated Steve, had some kind of issue with male authority figures. One day, Ray got in trouble, coming back from recess, and Steve reprimanded him verbally. By the time Ray makes it to the classroom, he's saying how Steve got in his face and shouted at him. Nope. He asks to go talk to the principal. Yay, Ray's gone for at least 5 minutes. Tells the principal how Steve grabbed his arm. When Mum comes in and gets him, now he's saying Steve pushed him. Next day, we get a phone call. Ray's mum and grandma are coming in and want a meeting with Steve and the principal to discuss how Steve choked Ray. Steve's freaking out. Sure, other kids were there, but no adults and no cameras. How can he prove his innocence? I tell him, go to the meeting and before anyone says anything, have Ray share what happened. Steve came back smiling. As soon as one story came out, everyone else was disagreeing. Well, Ray told me. Oh, but Ray told me. I would have loved to see the mum's face as her kid is proven a liar in front of everyone. Had a kid that threw a lock at my head not get expelled because it just slipped out of her hand. She then got expelled a few months later for bringing a weapon to school. We should really ban assault locks. No student needs a lock with more than 3 combinations. I'm not a teacher, but one time when I was at kindergarten, a kid looked me straight in the eyes, bit himself on the wrist hard, ran to the teacher and blamed me, that little C word. They sent me to the principal's office, my mum was called down and I got yelled at and cried. A week later, the kid did it again, and the teacher saw him do it. Felt so good to have the principal apologize profusely to me while that little craphead got a mouthful from his parents. I teach college students to be teachers. My first year doing this, I had a student who was always late, turned in the bare minimum of work and always had excuses. I told him he had to improve because if he did this on the job, he'd get fired. He kept coasting and the other profs let him get by. First teaching job? He got fired. I laughed in the privacy of my office and I'm not sorry. Oh no, the consequences of my actions. Seriously, I always wonder how these kids from university who don't seem capable of basic coordination or effort get on in life. Do some of them reform? Because honestly, this seems like the natural resolution, followed by them never holding down a job. I hope some of them get their crap together. We had these 2 kids, a brother-sister combo with fabulous names. Let's call them Princess and Major. Actually, not bad kids, just a bit lazy. But the parents were the laziest Fs in town. Did anything to not work, just sat around and existed. I'm surprised they had the motivation to get off their butts and procreate twice. Anyways, there was always some excuse why homework wasn't done, and this was 4th grade in a city. So homework was stuff like reading a little booklet to your parents or practicing multiplication facts. The kids also missed school all the time. The kids were honest. Mummy didn't want to wake up and get us ready for the bus. Daddy was up late with his friends. So, we report them to truancy. The parents turn around and find some lawyer to sue the school for their kids' underachievement. If the teachers were doing their jobs, these precious children would be pre-med students by now. Luckily, we kept really good records. The lawyer shows up, the principal, superintendent, truancy officer, and our lawyer. Their lawyer starts in, but our principal breaks in, holding up his hand. He asks the truancy officer, how many days have these children missed? Turns out they'd missed enough days in the last 3 years to equate for more than a year of school. The principal says, "Now, ma'am, sir, how are we supposed to deliver a quality education to your children if you don't get them to school?" Their lawyer quietly packed up her crap and left. I interned in a class with this one kid who always thought he was smarter than everyone else. He was pretty smart, but not by too much. He always got paired with kids not as smart as him, so he'd always be really smug when dealing with them. We learned that he got that from his parents during a parent-teacher conference. His parents praised that boy up and down and thought he was the smartest kid in school. They built him up as that and they got him thinking that too. Then they went off on my mentor teacher. That she wasn't providing him with a high enough education, she was bringing him down, she was terrible. The conference ended when my mentor teacher left the room crying after the verbal lashing. Well, about a week later, there was an event where parents came to watch their children in class. It was to watch them do math games with other students. Well, my mentor teacher paired this smug little jerk with the actual smartest kid in class, the one who was working on more advanced classes after school. The kid got shamed. His parents were so flustered during the event, they were visibly nervous and upset looking as this kid got destroyed game after game. They left before it was all done and took him out of school for the rest of the day. I coached middle school football. Some kids have come out of their shell by the time they get there, others have not. But at least most of the early bloomers were jerks and made life hell for everyone. The team's starting halfback was one of these jerks. He gave a defensive lineman hell, and since everyone thought he was cool, they just gave him hell right along with him. The lineman was a big guy, but not aggressive or outgoing. Still just in his shell, really. He did fine out there because he was a big guy, but hardly played to his potential. The little running backs took their Napoleon complexes out on the big guy by running by him and shouting, "Pansy!" every time he failed to stop them. Rather than fight back to make the play, he'd just ignore it and line up and try again the next play. One day, the whole thing just clicked for the big guy and he started making plays. He learned to get off his blockers and form tackle and attack the ball carrier. It was a cool thing to see. He loved it. When he really started getting into a groove, I started running the jerk halfback right at the blooming D lineman and watched him plant that guy in the ground with a thud every time. It was just getting easier as I made sure they ran the same play as him, play after play. Soon, bruised and beaten, the jerk halfback asked, "How many times are you going to run this play?" And I responded, "Once for every time you called him a pansy." First grade here, had a boy that wouldn't stop hitting kids with basketballs. He'd run up and pop the ball right at students. Sometimes he'd toss it real fast and say catch, but most often he'd just throw it at children on the playground who were completely unaware. This kid seemed like he was trying to knock other children down. He'd laugh his butt off if he saw someone stumble or fall after they were hit by his basketball. After talking with his parents, we told them we'd be taking the balls away from him until after the spring break to see if his behavior improved. As promised, he was allowed to play basketball again after break, but we warned he'd better behave. It didn't even take 5 minutes before he stalked and shot that Spalding special at this poor little girl, knocking her down. She cried and pointed at him, mulch dangling from her hair. "He's mean, Mrs. Misty." I agreed and told her he'd have the basketballs taken away for the rest of the school year. As I got up and walked his way, he started to bolt. He ran out of the playground, past the sandpit, and onto the basketball court. He maintained eye contact with me, and before I could take another step, a stray ball from a 5th grader hit the edge of the backboard, bounced off, and hit that little jerk square in the face. He went down like a sack of potatoes. Of course, I ran over to him and made sure he was okay. He might be acting like a little turd, but he's still just a child. I called for the nurse, since he was out cold. He woke up with me above him and started crying, saying he'd never do it again. "Please. I'm sorry, I won't do it again." I'll have to wait and see this coming year if karma kicked his butt enough or not, because he didn't want to pick up another basketball for the rest of the school year. I mean, I credit him with being able to put 2 and 2 together that this was what it felt like when he inflicted it on other kids. Normally, people present a breathtaking lack of understanding of the irony of these situations. But wait, did he think that this was a targeted hit that the teacher arranged to happen? Because if so, that's a little bit darkly hilarious. I had a 5th grader who looked like a white version of Cleveland Brown Jr., right down to the hanging cheeks and no neck. This kid was a know-it-all menace. He'd interrupt me, do that weird Rihanna hand twirl and say, "Well, actually, miss," and then state some random fact that was often wrong or irrelevant. Well, eventually, while on lunch duty, I saw that his lunch every day was a can of soda, a big bag of chips, and tons of candy. Like the bag is bursting at the seams. I alert the principal because I'm worried that his grandmother, who was raising him, wasn't feeding him properly. Principal calls the grandma and the grandma gets angry. She was letting him pack his own lunch and wasn't checking it. So she's embarrassed that we've called her on it. She tells us that she'll only pack healthy food now. She then tells us that the kid's doctor said he needs a serious diet change. She tells us he can't have any candy. Cue to a week later, the kid is still being a little brat and annoys another student. The student runs to principal and says the kid has been sneaking candy to school every day. The principal goes to talk to him. The kid shoves a chocolate bar in his mouth and the principal takes away the blow pop sucker that he has. The kid proceeds to roll around on his belly across the entire hallway, screeching and crying so hard that he's choking on the half-chewed chocolate bar. Chocolate spittle and tears are everywhere. A kindergarten student walks by and says, "You look like a baby." The kid stops wallowing long enough to punch the little student. He got suspended for violence and I got a peaceful classroom. Freshman English. Busted a kid for plagiarism. He was furious and refused to drop the course. I gave him a second chance. And he continued to plagiarize. He was a slimy, smarmy kid who thought I was just a dumb, clueless teacher's assistant, but joke's on him, he ended up failing the course 3 ways: plagiarizing, exceeding absences, and failing to turn in a complete final. You can argue about 1 way to get an F, but you can't argue about 3. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Last year I had a 7-year-old in my class who was just a pain. He's the only child I've ever taught who I've actually disliked. He'd throw things around the classroom, pinch other children, stab them with pencils. He was rude to everyone and would always blame it on someone else. Talking to his parents wouldn't help because they believed everything he said, even over adults who had actually witnessed him doing it. They'd give excuses and say that other children were blaming him or that he was being picked on. There was nothing wrong with this child other than that he had been brought up with no consequences in his life. Anyway, one time he was harassing another child and I guess they'd just had enough and this usually mild-mannered kid punched him in the stomach, causing the horrible one to wet himself. When following the incident up, all of the other children who'd witnessed it, about 5 or 6 of them, completely closed ranks and denied that it had ever happened. I don't usually condone when children hit back, it causes so many problems, but you had better believe that all the adults that had had to deal with this kid were rooting for the retaliator. I was in pre-kindergarten in the early 80s at a private Catholic school. This one kid, Amy, would always bite the other kids. I don't remember exactly how it went down, but I guess one day I came home crying or had a really bad bite mark or something and my mum was angry. She took me straight to the superintendent, not the principal, and showed her what happened. The superintendent, a really old nun, did not put up with that crap. She called Amy into her office and bit the frick out of her arm. Amy started crying, but she never bit anyone ever again. Old nuns in the 80s were hardcore. I'm not saying that what happened was right, just that it happened. College instructor here, I was teaching English 102. This little smart aleck kid was on a sports team as a student manager, and this was his life. He lived to pick up jock straps and clean lockers and all that. Well, anyway, that's fine, and I was happy for him. He sat in the front row and was always talking about stuff that happened with the team, or he was fiddling with his phone and iPod. Sometimes he was doing all of these things. He was a bit scattered. At this point, I was never really angry with him, just concerned. He was way too cool to actually do work when I gave the class time to work on their papers, and he decided he didn't need the book. I told him many times he needed to buckle down and get going. He didn't. For over half the semester. He'd just get up and leave class 15 minutes in if he decided he didn't want to stay. He'd make any class discussion hell for everyone else because he couldn't for some reason follow the thread of conversation and would ask inane questions. He was also kinda sexist and was always talking about various ways he'd cheated in classes or helped other people cheat. He was incredibly friendly though. I told him many times he shouldn't discuss these kinds of things in front of a teacher. So finally, I was telling the class that the last day to drop is tomorrow and blah blah blah. He comes up to me after class and asks if he should drop. I look at his grade, which is an abomination, and tell him, yes, I think the best course of action would be for him to drop. Well, he stopped coming to class, but he never dropped. I gave him an F. He sent me an email with a frowny face with lots of parentheses as the downturned mouth. I was teaching music. I had a flutist who was fantastic. He practiced 4 hours every day and wanted to be the next James Galway, the guy who does the fluty Shire theme in Lord of the Rings. Unfortunately, he had an ego the size of Texas. He told the girl next to him, who also wanted to be a professional flutist, that she was abysmal and a waste of life. He refused to audition for our local honor band, which was part of his grade, because he refused to lower himself to playing with such talentless musicians. He'd whine about my conducting in class when I wouldn't cue him, because I was too busy cueing the low brass who needed help with their entrances. You know, teaching instead of just letting him show off. He refused to play a theme from a popular video game at a concert, something that we play to get people to attend because we need money to keep the program going. It was apparently not artistic enough. Then he refused to show up to a concert because he was too embarrassed to be seen performing with this high school band. So he failed band and I kicked the toxic little monster out. But he was talented and he wanted to be a flutist, so he auditioned for Juilliard and made it in. This absolute dillweed quits before the first semester is over because he believed he was more talented than his teachers. He earned a symphony gig in a very well-known band thanks to a blind audition where he wasn't permitted to talk and reveal how much of a D-bag he was. That lasted 2 weeks before he dissed the very famous conductor's conducting and got his butt fired. His career is dead because he couldn't keep his ego in check, and I find it immensely satisfying. As usual, my policy is that you can forgive kids a certain amount of awful behavior because generally they grow up and cringe when they realize how terrible they were and learn from their mistakes. But this guy got multiple extra chances, plus more that our author likely didn't know about, and blew all of them, and apparently never stopped to question whether he was in fact the issue here. When I was younger, the teacher got tired of the kid who kept disrupting class, and she gave extra homework to everyone in the class except this kid and made all the students write, "Thanks for the extra homework," kid's name. Somehow he stopped believing he was cool after that. I taught a comparative anatomy animal dissection lab section back in college. I had one kid write in a section, let's call him Kevin, who never listened to dissection instructions and just dove in with a scalpel, dicing and chopping and generally mutilating most of the internal organs. His first karmic warning came when we were dissecting squid, and he got squid juice on himself. Smelled awful for the rest of that class. However, he kept ignoring instructions and hacking away, and this time, karmic justice struck on our very last dissection project, the fetal pig. Kevin really wanted to see the pig's brain. Kevin couldn't get through the skull, so he started whacking away at it with the butt of a flat pry knife. I told him to stop, but he had to give it one last mighty whack. Crack! The skull breaks and the rubbery piglet brain bits come flying out of everywhere, mostly over Kevin, splattering him. Unfortunately, while protesting my refusal to let him dice this piglet into pancetta cubes, Kevin had his mouth open. Thankfully, preserved pig brain, ingested orally, seemed to have a calming, subduing effect on Kevin for the last couple of classes. In short, don't jerk into sections unless you're willing to swallow. I once taught a grade 11 history class where I had one kid who caused me a lot of grief. He was frequently late, walking in 20 to 30 minutes each time. Class was during C slot, so he had a spare during B and would actually take the bus home after his A class and simply stay home for an hour, or just not show up at all. Additionally, he was super passive-aggressive, rarely handed anything in, and obsessed himself with spending time on his super expensive smartwatch and/or phone, which is also somewhat more of a big deal as my school is in a low-middle-income area and more than half of the students can't even afford a simple phone. Anyway, I'd pretty much had it with him. A major project comes up halfway through and he doesn't bother to do any of the group work. I weight projects around 50-50 personal input versus group mark, and then he didn't show up for the entire week of presentations. I'd had a lot of conversations with Mum at this point, who luckily had my back and was totally fed up with him too. Suffice to say, I gave him the only 0 in the class. So, of course, he hasn't learned and his grades are below failing mark. Test on the last unit before the exam is coming up, and I give the students the option to write a unit test and replace their lowest test grade with it. Obviously, every kid takes the chance. He saunters in late, and when I asked if he's going to do the op test, he just said, nope, sat down and played on his phone. I was a bit dumbfounded, but whatever. Oh, and I forgot this part. He came into class a few days later when I was handing back tests and announces, "I'm ready for my retest now, Mr. Hardshank." I looked at him and said how he could possibly think that's an option, especially as I'm in the middle of handing out the answers. He says, "Oh, well, I just thought I could write it any time." What? How could you get that idea? I say. Oh well, you're too late. How does it feel when you shoot yourself in the foot? Hurts, I guess, huh? Later I tell him he has until the last day of classes to hand in any missed work, of which he has lots. Some of which he hands in 50% finished at best, but that's it. Too bad. Obviously, he fails his exam and ends up with like a 45% or something. I could have failed him harder, but earlier group projects didn't have a personal input weighting like the last one did. My bad. Here's the justice. He comes to my room literally begging me to give him a passing grade. Looks like he's ready to cry. How can I fail him? All of the other teachers failed him too. Can't I at least give him a passing grade so he gets 1 credit? I hella noped. Basically said it's time to lay in the bed you made for yourself and told him he can see himself out. It was satisfying. In short, a super lazy, apathetic kid gets an F in my class, and that's not the worst of his problems. In high school, we had this little bag of crap named Brandon. I only had one class with him, but that class is where the story happened. It was 11th grade geography, and our teacher was one of the nicer teachers I can remember. Brandon would always push her buttons like I'm sure he did to everyone. He'd never take it too far. I think he just loved the attention of getting the whole class to look at him or laugh at what he was doing. He'd make stupid little noises, tell stupid jokes during lecture, pretend to sleep and snore, or any other stupid irritating crap that you could think of. Our teacher, she was quite a patient lady, but you could tell by mid-year that she had had about enough of this crap as anyone. She couldn't really even punish him because Brandon loved that kind of attention and it made him all the happier. The few times he got too much, she'd give him detention and a couple of times sent him to the office, which just made him more giddy. We had very tame office staff and they'd keep him in the office for an hour or something and then just let him out. She tried everything and you could tell she was at the end of her wits. A few weeks after September 11th, some kid thought it would be funny to call in a bomb threat. They cleared the school and went locker by locker. They found nothing, of course, and we went back in. As soon as we sat down in that geography class, an office staff member came into our class, went up to our teacher and whispered something in her ear. I still remember the calm look on her face. In the most professional way, she looked over at Brandon and said, "You're being called into the office." She went on with the rest of the class completely normally. They'd found quite a bit of green herb in Brandon's locker, and as a result, he was expelled over it. I teach kindergarten and had a terrible, terrible child in my class last year. He liked to pull his desk away from the girl sitting across from him so her pencils and crayons would go falling on the floor. Finally, one day she got fed up and slammed her desk back into his. Unfortunately for him, his fingers happened to be there. I had to resist the urge to be like, "That's what you get!" But instead I just reminded him that's why I said not to move his desk away from the rest of the table and sent him to the nurse. What was a bonkers story that a suspect told a cop or security officer that turned out to be true? My dad was stopped just outside of Detroit in the early 70s, flying down the highway in a Boss Mustang. The cop said it's either stolen or repossessed, which is it? My dad was a repo man, and it was a repo. I wish I could have seen his face. No ticket. No idea why he didn't get a ticket, actually. Obviously, repo men are subject to traffic laws. I suspect it's something about repossessing cars in Detroit proper in the early 70s. Not an ideal work site. I used to be an instructor for the security forces students in training, in this case the US Air Force cops. I was a weapon instructor, but we dealt with a lot of dorm inspections and all that other fun stuff. Well, this one kid kept falling asleep in class. After many counselings and some paperwork, he said he couldn't sleep because the devil was in his dorm room. Of course, we thought maybe he had some mental issues going on, but decided to get to the bottom of things. He said every night around midnight or later, he'd hear a voice saying to keep his eyes shut and nothing would happen to him. He was freaked out, so he complied. A couple of the instructors decided to sit with him in his room one night and told him to go to bed like he usually does. Well, lo and behold, around 1 a.m., the instructors heard something in the ceiling. They started freaking out a bit, but watched and waited. Next thing they know, they heard the voice and one of the ceiling tiles was moved and something jumped down. They flipped the F out and turned on all the lights to see what the frick was going on. Apparently, this other kid had been kicked out of the military while in training. He didn't want to go home and face his family, so every night he'd go into that kid's room, scare the crap out of him, and then take some food or something and stretch his legs for a bit. I guess he'd shower during the day but stayed up in the ceiling for the rest of the time. Needless to say, he was promptly sent home, and our freaked-out student was finally able to get some much-needed rest. A few things I want to clarify, though. Yes, the kid was 18. I referred to all the students as kids, since I've been in for about 15 years. All of them look like babies to this crusty old man. This happened around 2011-2012 timeframe at the firehouse, which is what we call that set of dorms. The guy living in the ceiling would say other crap to the kid, leading him to believe that he was the devil, and that he'd kill his family or some other crap like that. And for those asking why an 18-year-old would be such a wuss, I have to say you'd be surprised at the caliber of students that comes through training. They don't all get weeded out in BMT, which is sad, but a lot of them do grow into fantastic airmen and eventually NCOs. I wonder if this flipped the switch on the kid's life into being more or less fine after this, or if it actually haunted him forever and caused ongoing issues. Because on the one hand, great to know that the literal devil isn't haunting you and your family. On the other, that's a long time to be tormented for. So, dispatch advises my partner and I of a 911 call where the caller advises there's a pilot who parked a plane in his yard and then went to a nearby bar. Dispatch advises the caller doesn't speak conversational English and the call was translated via a translation service. Knowing the address is on a lake, I assume that there's been a mistranslation. Someone probably drove a boat up to his dock and went to the bar. The partner calls me. He's on the crapper and is going to be a hot second. He assumes the same thing regarding translations that I do. That's cool. I arrive first. Holy crap, there's an actual plane sitting there in his driveway. Specifically, a seaplane. Apparently it was driven up the boat ramp, then turned into his driveway and shut down. I call my partner. Yeah, you need to come here and see this crap. I go to the bar nearby. Alright, who owns the plane? A drunk guy does. Apparently he was there to visit his friend, landed on the lake and taxied to his friend's driveway. Except he got the addresses mixed up apparently, and now he's been drinking, so I don't want him to move the plane. Turns out, planes are light though, and he just pushed it into the correct driveway. 3 years ago, working in our civil department, the landlord wants his tenants out and says the usual things that set off the bullcrap meter. That they're substance users, criminals, thugs, keeping a prisoner in the mother-in-law suite. The landlord himself is a slumlord and says outrageous stuff for all of his tenants every time he wants to evict. Turns out that it was actually true in this case, at least partially. The tenants were a man and his elderly mother. They were keeping the man's developmentally challenged brother padlocked in the mother-in-law suite of the house with no plumbing or electricity. This family had been doing a rent-to-own thing with the landlord for about 10 or so years, and only recently stopped paying. Turns out they'd been feeding the brother through the mail slot in the suite's door, and the interior had no furniture besides the most disgusting mattress you can imagine. We don't know how long he'd been kept in there, but I've never seen a more revolting place in my entire life. These are not my pants. As we were cruising around town, we spotted a guy, Jim, who was wanted for questioning in relation to breaching an intervention order. He was in the passenger seat of the car with some other guy we didn't know, Bob. We pulled the car over, arrested Jim, and put him in the back of our car. As we're searching his car and searching Bob, Jim was one of our local substance dealers, I find a point of ice in Bob's pocket. So I'm telling Bob he's under arrest for substances, and he looks me dead in the eye and says, "Officer, I swear to God, these are not my pants." I almost laughed in his face. You can't be serious. That's the best you can come up with. But again, he said, "I swear to God, these are not my pants." And that is not mine. Apparently, Jim and Bob had a big night drinking at Jim's house, and Bob had misplaced his pants before passing out. When they woke up, Bob grabbed the first pair of jeans he found and drove Jim into town for some McDonald's, totally unaware of the substances in his pocket. A likely story if I ever heard one. So I open up our car and ask Jim, "Are they your pants?" "Yeah, they are. He couldn't find his own." "Can you tell me anything about what was in those pants?" "Ah, crap. Look, the point is that I didn't actually smoke yesterday." Jim made full admissions to owning both the pants and the substances, while Bob was happily free to go. In short, arrested a guy with ice in his pocket. His defense was, "Those aren't my pants. They really weren't his pants." So I'm patrolling in a beach tourist destination and it's about 2 a.m, so I was on the lookout for drunk drivers. There was a guy swerving a little bit up the road. He was on a back road and there was no one else around, so I decide to check it out. I flip on the lights and the guy pulls over immediately. I start chatting with the guy and he was slurring his words. I ask, "Where are you coming from?" "I'm just heading back to my hotel from the beach." "Any reason why you're swerving?" "I'm on some medication from a surgery I recently had and I'm pretty tired." So I was thinking, okay, buddy. I grab his license and registration, I run it, and it comes back clean. I take a look in his back seat with my flashlight on the way back. Not only are there 2 30-packs of beer in his back seat, the floor is absolutely littered with empty beer cans. "So, what's with all the beer in the back?" "Well, my neighbor really likes that brand of beer and he was house-sitting for us, so we're bringing some back to him as a gift." "So what's with all the empty beer cans on the floor?" "Well, while we were at the beach the other day, we saw a part of the beach that was trashed. I couldn't leave the beach like that." "All right, buddy, you need to step out of the car." So I make him take a breathalyzer and he blows a 0.0. I make him blow again, 0.0 all the way. Keep in mind, this guy is slurring his words left and right. So I ask him if I can take him back to the hotel and I'll drive his wife back to pick up his car. He agrees. I get to the hotel and his wife was worried sick because he'd been out so late. The wife confirms that he's on medication. He goes to sleep, and as the wife and I are walking out, I start questioning her. So, I saw a bunch of empty beer cans in the back seat. Does he drink a lot? Oh no, he insisted that we spend an hour of our beach trip cleaning up the beach. He wanted to drop off all the cans at the recycling center before he went back home. He doesn't drink at all. Interesting. There were 2 cases of beer in the back seat. Oh yes, my neighbor absolutely loves that beer. Can't get it where we're from. It was easily the most surprised I've ever been. And I should add that it wasn't the medication making him swerve, he was very tired, hence why he was driven back to the hotel and not arrested. The medication only made him slur his speech. Yes, it was Youngling Lager. Oh wow, not only was this guy telling the truth, he was also a really good Samaritan who went out of his way to tidy litter off the beach. Just don't drive if you're so tired that you can't go in a straight line, folks. We had a frequent flyer who'd call in at least once a week telling us people wanted to do the deed with him and wouldn't leave him alone. We'd send someone out there and he'd always be alone and it would be unfounded. One night he called and said he was at the store and a man kept asking to give him a down-under kiss. So we go out there and no one else is there. Surprise, but he said the person left and actually gave us a license plate number that had a local address. We went out there and the address was for a funeral home. The vehicle was a hearse, and the hood was still warm. After talking to the mortician, he confessed to actually soliciting this guy. For once, he was telling the truth. A friend of my parents worked for law enforcement as a psychiatrist for a time. An older lady was brought in one day, extremely distressed and yelling how her family wants to see her locked up in a psychiatric ward and take hold of all the silver mines she owns. My parents' friend went through the hassle to check the story just to be sure. Turned out to be 100% true. That lady was not one bit crazy. This actually happened to me and I was very thankful for how everything turned out. I was 19 or 20 and went to Applebee's with some co-workers after a crappy retail shift for the half-price appetizers. They were drinking, I wasn't because I was underage. As we were getting ready to pay, a co-worker reached over for his check and knocked over a tall beer that was damn near full straight onto my shirt and lap. No problem, it was an accident, whatever. The staff helped me clean it up and we went on our way, but I was still reeking of Bud Light. On the very first turn out of the parking lot and onto the main road, I had to swerve to avoid what looked like a tire in the middle of the lane, and obviously I saw the police lights in the mirror and thought I was totally screwed. The officer very obviously smelled beer and took a breathalyzer that didn't show anything, but he still wasn't sure. He took the time to listen to my story, plus my clothes were still damp, and he took me in the back of his car back to the Applebee's to confirm the story with the staff. Luckily, they all confirmed it was just spilled beer and I hadn't been drinking. He took me back to my car and let me go. The whole process took about 2 hours between him going back and forth with his dispatch and taking me to and from the Applebee's. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I went to a report of a mentally disturbed person who had called the police reporting that the devil called and told him to kill people on the street and then not be alive anymore. I checked his previous police files and he had a massive history of mental health issues. He was taken to the mental ward many times and was diagnosed with a form of paranoid schizoaffective disorder. Anyways, my partner and I showed up to talk to the guy. He was sweating bullets, his eyes were darting around, trembling and totally terrified. He explained that for the past 6 years the devil called him nightly via telephone, and then when he calls for help, the police take him to the mental institute. He says the devil tells him to kill people and then self-delete. As we were about to call our mental health unit to come talk to him, the phone rings. My partner answers the guy's phone at the guy's request. Guess what? Some jerk was using a voice changer and pranking this dude with mental health issues for years, pretending to be the actual devil. I can't tell you how surreal that moment was. The poor man's face changed, kind of, like he's finally been vindicated and he knows that it's not just in his head. So, we investigated that pranker and eventually charged him. The victim of all this was so frickin' happy. I was a detective for a few years, assigned to violent crimes investigations. I got called in one night for a male victim that literally was dumped out of a vehicle at the entrance to the emergency room. He had been shot in the side right around the hip area with a shotty, but was conscious and alert. While talking to him, he wouldn't give any information whatsoever about his name or anything. While in the ER, the doctor informed me that when they cut his pants off, he had a significant amount of smack in his pocket. He initially stuck to his story, and once discharged about a week later, he was arrested for that smack. This is where the story takes the turn. He immediately dropped the "those aren't my pants" story, which is more common than anyone could imagine, but still wouldn't give any more information about what happened. He finally did give all of his personal information, though. He was from out of state and couldn't make bond. So after sitting in jail for about 4 months, he finally decided he wanted to talk about what had happened. Turns out, on the night he was shot, he and some of his associates decided they were going to rob a known substance dealer. To achieve this, they dressed up as federal agents with BDU pants, full uniform-style shirts and badges. When they got to the house, they announced they were police, and as soon as he grabbed the glass door, the guy on the inside swung open the main door and fired a shotty through the outer door, striking him. Everyone ran back to the car, jumped in, and on the way, one of the other guys gave him clothes to put on so he didn't show up at the hospital with the uniform-style outfit. Every piece of his story was verified through the investigations, to include the substance dealer who had not replaced the glass door, and it was still shattered. So what's the more serious charge? Armed robbery and impersonating a police officer, or trafficking substances? Because actually I'm not sure that this guy got out of trouble any easier once they learned his crazy story was true. Then again, I guess it still fits the criteria of the video. A couple of rednecks on suspicion of murder tried to sell me on some ridiculous story. Said a group of college kids just showed up and started self-deleting all over their property. They must have thought I was some kind of moron to believe a story like that. This is a Tucker and Dale vs. Evil reference. Great movie. I work in air pollution control. One of our actual officers got an anonymous complaint call through the tip line about a body shop that didn't have the right equipment, was operating without a permit, that kind of stuff. Met the officer out there to inspect the place and see what's up. As I was pulling in, the shop's yard was a mess. Random wrecked cars all over the place, bits and pieces of engines and such under tarps, or just casually laying on a pallet. There's a small pile of tires in one corner. All it's missing is a chained-up Doberman and a razor wire fence. I was glad I had an officer along with me. We walked into the shop proper, and it's even more cluttered than the yard. There's bits and pieces of at least 3 different cars in old milk crates, and 2 different vehicles in various states of disassembly on the shop floor. I tell the owner why we're there, and he's kinda confused. Says he has a paint booth that he loans out to a buddy who does his painting for him, but he doesn't do very much work. We go through the whole speech about changing filters and such, and the guy is even more confused. He swears he just bought new filters for the thing. Those things are quite expensive. And he says again that he doesn't do all that much paint work. I'm not buying it given the state of the shop and the yard, so I ask to see the booth. He walks us into another building, and there's an absolutely beautiful paint booth in there. Everything is clean and the filters are in good shape. He's got the right sort of paint applicators, and all of his containers are covered and the ventilation is hooked up properly. There's not the faintest whiff of paint, let alone some sort of odor worth calling the tip line to complain about. I couldn't find anything to cite as a violation, and there wasn't even anything to warn him about. One of the better body shops I've ever been in as far as housekeeping goes. Now, we're all confused. The officer asks the guy if anyone from any other agency had been out to visit lately. The guy says no. Then we ask if maybe he fired someone lately, since sometimes former employees who get fired will call to complain and try to get their old boss in trouble. Again, the guy says no, just him and his dad that work in the shop, and his buddy that comes to paint. We all scratch our heads, trying to figure out who called in the complaint because there's nothing wrong here. On the way out, the officer casually remarks that he'd like to get his hands on a Camaro like that one over there. That's when the light bulb went off. Turns out the owner of the Camaro was unhappy with the speed of progress on his car. The shop owner had been working on it for free as a favor and had gotten bogged down with actual paid work, so he hadn't had the chance to finish it. They'd apparently argued about it a few days before we got the call, and the rest is history. I was lucky some law enforcement officers saw this happen to me, or I might have been otherwise in trouble. I was on my way to a party with some beer cans and a shopping bag. I decided I should open a beer on the way, only before I do I spot some cops standing close by. So I changed my mind about the beer since public drinking is illegal here. I put the beer back in the bag, still looking at the cops, so I miss the bag and it falls on the ground and a small pebble punctures the can, causing it to spray. Panicked about the beer, I pick it up and try to block the hole, but spraying beer all over myself instead. After some quick thinking, I figure opening the can would actually alleviate the pressure from the hole, and I was right. Only now I'm standing somewhere in public with a half-opened beer can in hand, in broad view of the police, and I'm reeking of beer. Apart from being sober, it sure looked like I was drinking in public. Those cops didn't bother me about it at all. My two buddies hike at night. I don't know why, and in our state you can get trespassing charges for being out after dark in parks. They saw a park ranger, they assume looking for them since they parked in the lot. After backtracking about a mile and a half, they have this dumb idiot idea. The one buddy starts running back up the trail screaming, "Help, there's a bear chasing me." The other buddy is running up the trail making a bunch of bear noises. I don't know how that would go. As my buddy is reaching the ranger, he's like, "Run the other way, there's a bear!" And the ranger runs out of the woods with him. I was a counter-narcotics operator who'd deploy with the US Navy and Coast Guard. One trip, we were just patrolling the coast off Guatemala with intel on a suspected trafficking boat. We locate a radio contact in the vicinity and launch a small boat, a 19-footer, with interdiction team. It was an unannounced nighttime boarding, so the idea was speed, surprise, violence if action. Got close, within 30 feet undetected, turned on all the spotlights and strobes and began yelling for all people on board to put their hands in the air. The only person on board was hanging over the opposite side and wouldn't put his hands up. Several times he was instructed to do so or possibly be hurt if he refused. In all the yelling and confusion, no one heard what he was trying to tell us. Finally, the dust settled and everyone took a breath, and the man explained he couldn't put his hands up because he'd caught a shark and was losing most of his fishing equipment. I went over and saw that he had indeed got a 5-foot shark fighting just over the side. We helped him pull it up a little and he beat it to death with a baseball bat. Saved all of his tackle. Didn't find any illegal substances, though. This is one of those stories that would have actually made a lot more sense if the guy was on substances, because why on earth would you try and bring in a relatively big shark if you have the wrong size hooks and only a baseball bat to try and remedy the situation? I live in a small town in Australia. This guy was out fishing in the bush when an elephant goes running past. So he reports it to the cops, who proceed to laugh and ask what he's been smoking. The next day, someone came in to report a missing elephant. Turns out some circus elephants had been retired to a local farm. Night shift in an extremely rural part of the home counties in the UK, about 3 a.m. on a Wednesday. The call comes in that someone's pulled up to the victim in a white Range Rover, jumped out and held our informant up with a sawn-off shotty, and their iPhone was taken about 30 yards from their own front door in a quiet residential street. We turn up to the informant's address and I weirdly remember the street but can't place it. I go inside and the informant is on the internet looking at new iPhones. Slightly suspicious. We talk and he tells me about what's happened. He doesn't seem fazed at all. As we're talking, I remember the street as I was there a few months ago for a burglary a few doors down, and he had recommended that the owner get CCTV. I go over there and sure enough, there's a CCTV camera above his garage. I wake him up and view it. Sure enough, it happened. Everything. Got the registration of the vehicle, and the RO was arrested for armed robbery. The weapon turned out to be a replica, but it was just so bizarre. You wouldn't believe how many calls we get about people accusing someone else of tricking them into drinking pee. It happens at least once a month and sometimes once a week. One time it was true and we went after the guy. Some prankster called a hotel, got the guest to think he had a transmitted disease, and needed to bring a cup of pee down to the front desk. He told them not to cause an alarm, so just put it on the desk and walk away. Then the guy called the front desk and said that he was a sport drink CEO and had a new energy drink for him to test out. The guy drank pee. It went viral and there have been a few copycats out there. There's nothing funny about making someone drink pee, people. Identical twins. What happened when you were mistaken for your twin? My twin brother recommended a restaurant to me. Said that he and his wife went there all the time. Good food, really friendly staff. So, I took my wife there. Food was as advertised, but the service, somewhere between cold and openly hostile, like they resented our presence. I was puzzled by the contrast between what I'd heard and what I saw. Suddenly from the front of the restaurant there was an explosion of laughter and much rapid talking. Suddenly the waitress is there smiling and everything, just as my brother and his wife walk around the corner. So the restaurant thought my brother was cheating on his wife with some blonde. Yeah, it's funny now. Not a twin, I'm just Asian. Constantly asked about work projects I'm not involved in. Realize coworkers think that I'm just the other Asian guy. Oh god. In college I was working on a group project and randomly assigned teams. We had an Asian team member, and it was a pretty big class of about 60 students. During the first class, after being assigned groups, we broke up into our teams to begin planning, and I noticed that the Asian kid looked a bit lost. So I waved him over, figuring he'd got confused among all the moving around. Anyway, we began delegating out our work and responsibilities and exchanged contact info. Everything was going well until we were joined by our real Asian group member who was running late. At that point, pretty much everyone in the group busted out laughing. I went to a party once, and my bald identical twin bro had yet to arrive. His girlfriend was already there, so I gave her the obligatory friendly hug, then sat on the other side of the room to hang out. This other guy, a mutual friend of his and hers, kept staring at me, then staring at her, with this real nervous, "what the frick" look on his face. For about 15 minutes, every so often the guy would look around nervously and then furiously text on his phone. Then my brother arrives. He kisses his girlfriend and says hi to everyone, and the guy who had been staring at us just blew up. Jesus, was no one going to say anything? What the frick was that? I thought he grew a full head of hair in a day. Not me, but a coworker has 2 sets of twin daughters. A younger pair are identical and both work at the same McDonald's. The manager often puts one on the pay window and the other on the food window just to mess with customers. That's phenomenal. If only you could get just a couple more, maybe you could make people think that McDonald's had perfected human cloning. I only hope that right now some of the customers think that one staff member is sprinting around running the whole joint like a cartoon character. I'm not an identical twin, but I am married to one. When I was dating my wife, she and her twin sister had a bunch of friends over. I walked over to her and put my arm around her and she leaned into it. I leaned in for a kiss and she pulled away. I thought, well, maybe she's just not comfortable with a little peck in front of our friends, since we haven't been dating for too long. Then I scanned the room and made contact with my girlfriend. I looked back in awe that I had my arm around her sister, who was messing with me until things went too far. I then tucked my tail between my legs, walked over to my girlfriend, put my arm around her and said, "Well, will you give me a kiss?" Smooth cover, right? My twin brother had a huge stash of adult magazines in his closet, and I always wondered where he got the money to buy them. One night I walked into a nearby convenience store with some friends, and the guy behind the counter threw me out. I had no idea why. When my friends asked, he told them he'd caught me stealing adult magazines the week before. I'm not a twin, but my brother and I look startlingly similar, even being almost 2 years apart. I've been ranted at by teachers, faculty, and other members in grade and high school for being in the wrong room, or this isn't your lunch schedule, or had people get furious that I didn't know what they were talking about for homework or sports practice or whatever. What takes the cake, though, is that I had leg surgery in high school, and someone called me out for faking my injury because he saw me at practice at night and in a wheelchair during the day. Don't flip out at somebody in a wheelchair at school. Seriously, who fakes broken legs to be cool? My twin had recently decided he didn't want to be alive anymore, and I was at a bar drinking away my rage, and a friend of his came up and flipped out at me, saying how awful of a prank it was, and took everything I had not to remove their teeth with my fist. My father is an identical twin. He was mistaken for my uncle while walking with a woman hand in hand down the street in London, England. The witness was a friend of my aunt and immediately called her to accuse her husband of infidelity. She was at that moment sitting beside my uncle in Ontario, Canada. I was dating a girl in college. The first time I went to her house, she opened the door, I told her that I liked what she'd done to her hair and kissed her. She kissed me back, we went inside, and then she yells, "Your boyfriend's here," and walked away. They were weird girls. My brother and I dated twins way back in the day. They used to do crap like this to us all the time. Frickin' weird, you don't even know. I've been called my twin sister's name my whole life, so one day I accidentally introduced myself to someone as her. When I caught and corrected myself after, they thought I was straight up crazy for not knowing my own name. Oh boy, I dated one of 2 identical twins. They used to play pranks on me where they'd pretend to be the other one or switch places to test me. That all stopped when I walked up to the wrong one, grabbed onto her butt, and told her some of the very explicit things I planned for her booty later that night. Needless to say, one twin found it hysterical while the other less so. Pretty much for the following 3 years we dated, the other twin used to say, "Good night and guard your booty," every time we went to bed. When we were in the 6th grade, my brother decided he wanted to stay at home because he wasn't feeling well. So far, there had never been a day where only one of us was at school, but I didn't think anything of it. I was walking down the hall and all of a sudden I was pulled in by a teacher who I'd never seen before and she started yelling at me, and I mean yelling, because I'd skipped her class and I had the audacity to walk in front of it right after. It was really awkward to just say, I have an identical twin brother. My name is Joseph. She, of course, thought that I was making a terrible excuse, and I had to go get another teacher that knew I had a brother to come tell her that I was telling the truth. She never bothered me again. Other than that, we've never had a super embarrassing story. A friend and his wife went to the supermarket every week. His identical twin also goes there with his wife. One day, after summoning up the courage, the cashier pulls my friend's wife aside and says, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I've seen your husband here several times with another woman. We were out with friends, and he decided to go to one of the back rooms, which was set up for a private party with bottles of spirits everywhere. Well, he decided to take a bottle and run off. Cut to me in the club, and some bouncers came up and took me to the back room saying, you're screwed, mate. We saw you on camera stealing a bottle. Blah, blah, blah. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about, and they thought I was just playing dumb to get away with it. Yeah, nah, you can stop it, mate. We've got you on camera. Somehow I finally convinced them I had a twin, so they fished him out and eventually said we need to come back tomorrow to settle the damages. Well, obviously we weren't doing that. Fast forward to about 2 weeks after, I was staying at my girlfriend's mum's house and got woken up by her mum at 6 a.m. Hey Mish, the police are here. What? I got arrested and put in the police car where my twin was already sitting. Interviews, long waiting, disappointing polystyrene lunches, and got off with a warning. Thanks, John. I have twin friends who went to separate high schools and switched places on April Fools. Not embarrassing, but totally worked. My friend said hi to his brother one morning. Well, it turns out his brother was actually his own reflection in a window. His mum witnessed this and has never let him live it down. I mean, considering how many times I've scared the hell out of myself by walking past a mirror, I think the parameters set by having a twin make something like this completely reasonable. My friend Daniel got caught tickling his pickle. He said he was his twin, Alex. Some girl decided to suggest that I date a guy that looked very, very much like me. Yes, those were her words. There's this guy who looks so much like you, you two should get together. What's his name? Paul? Yeah, you've met him? Yes, that's my brother. My father spent a year abroad before returning to enroll in the same college as his twin brother. The first few days were pretty standard. Acquaintances of my uncle mistaking my dad for him, business as usual. That is until one girl approached him, publicly mind you, and with a wink said, "You were really great last night. I gave your number to a few friends. I hope you don't mind." Naturally, my dad went from there to immediately seek out and congratulate his brother on his good fortune, and hopefully share some of the spoils. On the way, he found himself receiving a disproportionate level of sly smiles and sidelong glances from some of the groups he'd passed. By the time he finally found my uncle, he was thoroughly perplexed. Surely his brother couldn't have been this lucky. They were good-looking guys, but this was just ridiculous. My uncle flushed and faltered when confronted by my dad. He stammered and tiptoed around the issue before my dad finally got it out of him. How had he pleased so many women to establish this reputation? He hadn't. Turns out my uncle had spent all of his money in the first few weeks and had turned to desperate measures for cash. He had been working as an exotic dancer, mostly doing private parties, but naturally word had got around. So, for the rest of the year, my father had to contend with the fact that a good number of the people on campus had effectively seen him in the buck. Not a twin, but a mistaken identity. I was working at a local grocery store as a cashier. My next customer was a lady, maybe mid-30s. She walked through my line, looked at me and said, "When did you start working here?" About a year ago, I guess. "Does your dad know you work here?" "I sure hope so, since my mom works in the pharmacy." A look of pure shock ran across her face as she gasped, "Oh my god, I thought you were my son." I didn't know how to react and I just stared at her. "You look just like him. This is strange." "Well, a little, since you're his mom," and I laughed. I never saw her alleged son to know if we looked that similar, and every time after that she had come to my line and called me Junior. That was when it got weird. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. My twin's boyfriend tried to kiss me. I'm a straight man. Well, my friend Alex got caught tickling his pickle. He said he was his twin, Daniel. My grandmother was an identical twin. Her sister passed away before I was born. She didn't like to tell stories from when she was little, but she did tell me more than one mistaken identity story. She was in their bedroom one night when they were really young and saw her sister through the window. She started talking to her sister to see why she was outside at night. Then she realized it was her reflection. My grandmother had mistaken herself for a twin. One day I was looking through her photo albums and came across some pictures of her twin in her coffin. That picture haunted me until I actually had to see my grandmother in her coffin. What's strange from all these stories for me is how many people are clueless their friend has a twin sibling. I mean, of course you don't go around explaining to everyone that you're a twin. However, to go through school, where your twin also attends, and to have friends that know you pretty damn well, still not have any idea that you have a twin sibling? What's going on? I have two younger cousins who are identical twins. They grew up being the boys for pretty much all of their childhood, and they did everything together. They're a lot alike, so they'd always get mixed up, sometimes even by their parents. After hitting the teenage years, they both actively started wanting to separate, to the point that they had radically different haircuts. One has a man bun, for example, and they attended separate high schools. They're tired of being so closely associated. Because of that, they don't like to introduce themselves as twins, and I doubt they feel the desire to volunteer that information either. I'm sure this is the case for many other identical twins as well. I worked retail for a few years and had a lot of regular customers. This one girl would come in and she was awesome. She loved the product, always made conversation over what she was doing, what she had done, and we always connected. Sometimes she'd initiate the conversation, sometimes I would. Never really learned her name though, which is pretty embarrassing in sales. About a year and a half after knowing her, she walks in one day and I wave to her, she excitedly waves back. All of a sudden, a perfect frickin' clone, in a similar outfit but different colors, walks out from behind her. My jaw literally dropped. I was in disbelief. I'd been talking to two twin sisters, thinking they were the same person for over a year. When I asked why they never pointed it out to me, one goes, "Well, you just seemed to talk to me like you knew me, so I went with it." It was a surreal experience, honestly. I'm not a twin, but my boyfriend is. We were walking to class when a girl approached us. She confronted my boyfriend about why he stopped talking to her or hanging out with her. At first, it was extremely awkward for me, but I figured out what was going on and I laughed it off. Turns out she was a crazy girl that his brother once saw and talked to one time in their dorm laundry room and didn't talk again after that instance. A family friend was in the Air Force, and while in boot camp, she became mortal enemies with another woman who'd constantly try to one-up everyone and win any argument for whatever reason. Our friend found her sleeping around with some other officers a few years later and got her discharged from service because of it. 10 or so years after that, our friend's twin was walking around town on the opposite side of the country, and this woman barges across the street and starts berating her for ruining her life and all this other stuff. And the twin just laughed it off because she knew it was probably her sister's fault. It says a lot about the Air Force twin that the other one was so ready to believe that her sister was the cause of ruination in someone's life. I know that she could already assume that strangers who came at her claiming shared events that she didn't know about were in fact thinking of her sister, but to be ready to laugh rather than be shocked about something like this, it had to have happened before. My flatmate and I dated identical twins while in university. Nothing happened. No hijinks. If you're a twin, you're bound to eventually have a few embarrassing stories. My whole life has been a system of awkward hugs or ducking a kiss from a girl and yelling, "Wrong one, wrong one!" Your brother's girlfriend jumps in your lap while you're watching a movie? It happens. My personal favorite has to do with situations that have occurred due to mistaken identity with my brother, now that he's a Marine officer. I joined the Peace Corps shortly after he became an officer. Yeah, we're a sitcom setup, and I worked as a teacher in Eastern Europe. Over drinks at a dinner during my service with friends of my host family, one of the gentlemen tells me that he used to be a Soviet helicopter pilot and asks me if I'd like to see his uniform. He brings down the full outfit in all of its medalled glory. We're almost exactly the same size and he lets me try it on. Thinking how cool this is, I post a picture online wearing it to show everyone. My brother calls me a few days later, angry as hell, because during his screening for security clearance, someone finds pictures of him wearing perfectly tailored Soviet regalia. He yells at me for getting brass up his butt and complains that he might get his clearance postponed. We still laugh about it. It was during those awkward middle school days and my twin sister got her first boyfriend. We had our first 8th grade dance and thought it would be so funny to switch places with each other to see if her boyfriend noticed. He didn't and proceeded to go in for the big first kiss. That didn't go so well. They broke up and it was an emotional 2 weeks for my poor little twin. Oh, middle school. My two friends are twins, one boy, one girl. We rented a house in Wildwood, New Jersey after our senior prom. The girl twin brought her boyfriend and the boy twin brought his girlfriend. Me and the boy twin were sitting on the couch of the house when the girl twin's boyfriend came home from a run, leaned over the couch and gave the boy twin a kiss hello. He didn't realize what had happened until he stood up. It was hysterical to me because the twins resemble each other, but not enough to make that mistake. I was on a date for over an hour before she realized I wasn't my brother. My brother had been in a committed relationship for over a year, and the date just assumed he was on this date to cheat on her. A while back when I was in middle school, I went over to one of my good friend's house. His mum comes in, we start talking about random stuff, and then she asks my name. I'd known this woman for 5 or 6 years at this point, so I was kinda confused. The conversation continues for a very awkward minute or two, and then my friend's mum walked in as well. I didn't even know she had a sister until that day. My mum and aunt are identical twins, and my girlfriend's parents own the only restaurant in my small town, and they've told me how they thought my mother was having an affair. Also, I've got texts from friends that my mother was with another man. I send a picture of my uncle, and it's always him. Let me preface this by saying I'm a junkie, smack addict, and I'm still just sober now. It was 2008, I'd just got out of rehab, and I was invited by my brother to join a gym he went to for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I was smoking a cigarette outside, and a guy got aggressive with me, and he told me to put it out or he'd choke me out. I felt threatened, and I threw the cigarette at his eyes and got a cheap shot and knocked him out. Turns out he was a friend of my brother's, who was a brown belt instructor at that gym. A good friend of mine is a twin. I only know one of the twins well, and I've spoken to the brother maybe twice in 15 years. My friend is the wild twin, and the brother is very laid back. I live in a big town of more than 100,000 people, with plenty of pubs and clubs. My friend ended up getting barred from most of them over a period of a few months, and then started drinking out of town. His twin didn't know how bad it was until he was out one night with his wife, and the bouncers let him in anywhere, much to his wife's fury. The twin tried to tell the bouncers, "It's not me, it's my twin." That didn't work at all. It eventually was settled when he rang his brother, made him come into town, and went around every bar to the bouncers to prove that he wasn't the banned twin. They took note of his ID, kept the ban on my pal, and let his twin go on enjoying his night. One bouncer joked with them both and said he had heard that story hundreds of times and never thought he'd see the day where it was true. Yes, I love telling twin stories. When I used to live at home with my parents and sister, I was blow-drying my hair in our bathroom. I was in my bra and undies because, God, it gets hot in there, and I'd just gotten out of the shower. I cracked the door an inch to get air. I was busy drying, and I see my sister's boyfriend coming into the bathroom. He wasn't over before, and I was like, hey? And when I turn, he freaks because he thought it was my sister. He was at the door waiting until my sister noticed him, which backfired, because it obviously wasn't her, it was me. It was more embarrassing for him because he felt bad. It was an honest mistake. Other times I'll be out and about and people will come up and hug me out of nowhere. I love the hugs, but it's more embarrassing for the person when they realize I'm not my sister. I don't think it's a big deal, but they're always so apologetic. My brother and I both entered into the science fair. Before the awards ceremony, he got sick, so I went with just my mum. My brother won first place, and I didn't place at all. When they called his name, my mum made me go up for him. I stood on a stage, looked out at the sea of friends and teachers clapping for me while a medal was hung over my shoulders and a certificate was shoved into my hands. In the moment, I should have felt proud of my brother, but instead I just started crying on stage and weirded everyone out. I think they must have thought I was just overwhelmed with happiness, because even when I stepped off the stage and made a beeline for the back door, people continued to congratulate me and try to shake my hand. It was such a bizarre emotion, like a blend of jealousy and shame. I walked straight to the back, past my mum, and left. In middle school, we had two boys everyone knew were identical twins. At lunch, twin A had been arguing with this group of boys talking crap just to rile them up. Afterwards, they went down the hall towards his locker wanting to kick his butt. While they were on the warpath, twin B just happened to turn the corner and run into that group of boys, completely oblivious about what had just happened at lunch because they had different class schedules. Twin B got his butt kicked for his twin's actions, not knowing the reason behind it. When was a job applicant perfect until you Googled them? Hiring private tutors to work with middle school students. Had a great conversation with a girl. She stressed how much she wants to be a role model for young girls, basically exactly what we were looking for. Then I Googled her, and the first picture on her Facebook is her doing a line. I wasn't the hiring manager, but my teammate was. A candidate came through that he and some other members interviewed and seemed pretty okay for the job until they checked her out. Turns out she was already suing the company. Yes, the one she applied for a job for, so my teammate ended up not going with her in the end. This kid, early 20s, comes in for a job and seems normal enough. Google him and he was wanted in another state for stabbing a St. Bernard to death. I was interviewing a much older guy for a similar position of mine. Everything seemed okay and he was our best candidate. Before moving forward, I did a quick Google search only to find out that he was fired from his previous job because of stealing $5,000 worth of computer equipment. My director hired him anyway. Did everything work out? The original poster can't answer because he got his computer stolen. I wasn't the hiring manager, but I was talking to him about a couple of interviews he had coming up. He said that he looked up one guy and found out that he'd been arrested previously for various identity theft and credit card fraud crimes. This position involved taking payments from customers, among other things, so obviously this guy would not be hired, but that had to have been an awkward interview. I was a restaurant manager, and the owner hired this guy as a chef without doing basic research. This happened a few times. Anyway, the guy said he'd won several awards and worked with celebrities, stuff like that. And he was a total jerk to everyone on staff. I decided to Google him myself. First hit is a mugshot from a substance arrest. Then more articles, one concerning how he lied about getting a James Beard award from a previous restaurant he'd worked at. A comment about him owing 25 grand or something to his former boss. The only positive restaurant review he had was from 1990. I came in after the weekend to show my boss this stuff and learned he'd already been fired the night before for exposing himself to one of the waitresses. What do we even do before Google? Silver lining is that in this day and age, at least this sort of guy is going to have a tougher and tougher time finding places that will take him on with that very public track record. I worked for a staffing agency. A guy is hired and comes in for background and substance screening. He has lots of priors, but he was working in a kitchen, so we got the okay to continue the process. It wasn't until the substance screening that he seems to get a little nervous. I tell him that we're going to do the screen now, and he asks to put it off until Monday. Typically, we'd want to do it same day so they could start work, but this was like 4:45 on a Friday and we just wanted to go home, so we said yes. Monday rolls around and he shows up. He takes the test and it comes up positive for green herb, white snow, and a bunch of other stuff. We told him that we test multiple things and that white snow also showed up. We asked him if that was a surprise. He told us, "I do dabble in that, but I just thought this was a test for Mary J." We politely said that we couldn't hire him. There are so many weird stories from working at a staffing agency, believe me. This was back in the pre-Google era, but I think it fits the question. Family owned a trucking company. Literally everyone in my immediate family has or had a commercial driver's license. It was Mum's turn to take the newbie for a road test pre-hire. During that road test, they were involved in an accident. They were hit while stopped, so it wasn't actually his fault. The company was based out of Indiana. The accident happened in Illinois. The newbie gets arrested on the spot. We came to find out he has warrants that hadn't been out long enough for the background check service we used to get them yet. One of the warrants, stalking a female dispatcher from the previous trucking company he worked for. So yeah, the police came just to take the accident report, did standard wants and warrants check, and homie got a new set of bracelets. Had a guy apply for an entry-level post with us recently. His CV was okay, so we offered him an interview. Social media seemed okay too. He never turned up for the interview. Couple of weeks later, there's a story about him in the local paper. Turns out he was living at the local boarding house and was found in the kitchen one morning, totally wasted, wearing nothing but a pair of socks. When a couple of women who also lived there tried to escort him back to his room, he got violent and attacked them. Given the dates stated in the paper, he didn't turn up because he'd been in jail at the time of the interview. His resume has now been added to the "Do Not Touch with a 10-foot barge pole" section in our filing cabinet. Oh, I've got a good one. We had hired a new entry-level graphic designer. Let's call him Will. He had talent and a decent portfolio, but there were some strange things right from the beginning. For example, he'd always come in wearing expensive suits, despite us being a jeans and t-shirt office, and he had a very low-paid position. We didn't care too much about that. No clue how he affords that wardrobe, but that's none of our business. He's a designer, and I guess he likes to look nice. The weirdest thing was that he adamantly refused to accept direct deposits for his paycheck. He wanted a physical check every other week. Strange, but okay, designers are just eccentric sometimes. So one evening we were all working really late on a project together. We've got some bottles of wine around, some pizzas. It's miserably long hours, but we're a good team and we're having a good time. All of a sudden, Will looks up from his computer and frickin' runs as fast as he can out the door. Not a word to any of us, he just dashes out. We all look at each other and try and call him. No answer. We finish up the project and go home wondering still what had just happened. The next day, Will doesn't come into the office. He doesn't come in the next day either. We try calling his emergency contact, but don't get any response from that either. So we Google him, and that's when we see the FBI press release. Turns out he was arrested about 500 miles from our office a few hours after he ran out. I guess he got a tip that the FBI was onto him and decided to make a run for it. His scam was pretty weird. He exploited a gimmick in how direct deposits work. Most payroll companies at the time would deposit the salary and shortly afterward withdraw the funds from the employer's bank account. So, he'd set up fake companies with a few highly paid fake employees, set up a fake bank account for them, and then set up direct deposits. When the payroll came through, he'd quickly transfer the funds to his own account and then disappear. He did this 3 or 4 times with different companies, as I understand. It's a stupid scam and easy to track, which is why he got caught. I don't recommend that you try it, especially now that most systems work differently. Turns out he'd been defrauding payroll companies for years, to the tune of about $1 million. That's why he didn't want direct deposit for his paycheck. What he didn't know was that we processed our physical checks through the same payroll company as our direct deposit, and they reported his new address to the FBI. Whoops! As far as I know, he wasn't trying to scam our company. He was either trying to hide out for a while, or he'd burned through his stolen money and needed to get a job. I hired a girl and she interviewed well, but the first day she threw up some red flags. I figured maybe I was misjudging or misinterpreting. People started missing money, and one day one of my belongings disappears, which had never happened prior to her hiring. She was insulting everyone and making customers uncomfortable, and I wanted her gone. Less than 4 full weeks from her start date, but I didn't want to pay unemployment. I finally do a search. There are arrest records in multiple states involving domestic attacks and theft. She ended up saying she could just commit the unspeakable act on one of my barely legal employees, so I was able to fire her based on that. Lesson learned. Check everyone out no matter how well they interview. I guess not. You heard it here, folks. Doesn't matter if they're Ivy League, a gleaming golden personality, and multiple photos of them handing off large checks to charitable organizations. Google those people and find out if they're secretly running illegal distilleries with child labor. I used to manage a group home for developmentally disabled adults. I was in charge of hiring the staff that we needed to make the house run properly. I saw a name come across my desk that I had to interview, and I instantly looked them up. Turns out, this was a girl that had an obsessive crush on me from years ago, and on her social media it looked like she still did. I was in a panic because she was basically stalking everything I did, and I really couldn't back out because it was 5 minutes before the interview. She came in and it was so weird. She acted normal. We interviewed in a professional manner for about 15 minutes. I showed her around and thought, wow, maybe she's done some maturing. I should just let this go. Then we got back to my office. I started a sentence like, well, Linda, it's been a pleasure having you here, and oh, no, we aren't done yet. You think you can ignore everything like you don't know what's going on? I know where you work now. I know where you live, and I'm going to keep calling. There was more she was saying while I told her to kindly leave, but a phone call to the police, as well as a restraining order, kept her away from my work and my life. I was hiring for our night shift, like shifts ending at 2 or 3 a.m., and she was willing to work anything and looking for about 25 hours per week. This was absolutely what the company was looking for. She had mentioned that she was grieving her little boy who passed 2 weeks ago and needed to do something to occupy her time. She finished her 1 day of computer training and stopped showing up after that. Later in the week, she sent me an email saying she wasn't ready to come back to work like she thought, which was actually understandable. My assistant manager and I decided to look her up, only to find out that she had multiple GoFundMe pages set up for her sob story with different amounts of time that the supposed child had been dead for. Her Facebook was full of selfies and party photos. She ended up asking for the job back a few months later, and we shot her down pretty quick. I recently Googled her name and found that all the GoFundMe pages had been taken down and her social media profiles deleted and privatized. The story took place early last year. Where I work, they hired a guy who was great at the job and a nice, quiet employee. His background check took forever to clear for some reason, but it ultimately came back clean. Eventually, he said he needed to take a day off for court, but he just never came back after that day. Upon looking into it, he'd been found guilty of very inappropriate behavior with a minor on more than one occasion. That must have been why it took so long to come back. They were unsure if it should be reported since it was pending. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Oh, we had a near miss. It was a senior hire. We were talking about him and how something seemed a little off when we Googled him. It was like he didn't exist at all, and then the odd super positive tidbit of information that was always a bit too much of a stretch to be completely believable. I mean, 1 or 2 people saying that you're the best thing on earth is one thing, but this was like all you've got with these sporadic, hyper-manic observations. One of the junior members of the team pipes up at this point. She's overheard what we're talking about. Turns out she's worked the last 2 places he worked at, and he's like a locust. He's extremely good at his job, but an absolute nightmare in all other ways. Misconduct, bullying, turning up wasted. He has a really niche skill set, and there are always more roles than people to fill, so he hops along, bullies everyone out of their role in his team, brings in his entourage to the point where almost anyone normal rage quits because the atmosphere is so toxic, and then when HR try to step in, he hits them with a constructive dismissal case and drags lawyers in, so there's no paper trail. She said he'd done it at her last job and the one before that. It's one of those things that once you know, you start to notice stuff. So at events when someone mentioned this guy's name, half the table would just give each other a look, and others would have no idea. It's not quite an open secret, but it's definitely on the grapevine anecdotally, if not formally. I'm so glad we dodged that bullet. I heard we'd hired a new guy, so I looked him up on LinkedIn. Turns out he was just leaving a job where my father-in-law worked. I sent Pops a text and asked him about the new hire and opinions on him, and didn't get an answer. When I went for dinner the following weekend, I asked again. Turns out this new hire said he was leaving his former job to go and take care of his ailing mother in Africa. His former company said not to worry about it, take an unpaid leave and come back when you can, however long that takes. I went in on Monday and told my boss. He didn't fire him immediately, but when he didn't perform well in his job after a couple of months, he got canned, and then proceeded to go back to his former company and tell them he was back from Africa. They did not rehire him. I was the intern responsible for checking references and running backgrounds at our company, and this was in my first week where I was just learning how to go about things. This guy did great in the interview, so I got the go-ahead to run a background check and call his references. Something popped up in his background, so I had to call the police station to figure out how to get a copy of the police report, since whatever happened had just happened. I talked to someone on the phone and gave them his name, and who I was and what I was calling for. After doing so, whoever I was talking to didn't know how to go about obtaining the information on her end. She put me on a brief hold, then took a callback number and promised to call me back with some info. Well, it's a good thing neither of us knew what to do because I received a call from the police department less than an hour later. An officer told me, "I'm not really supposed to be doing this, but I just wanted to let you know that your guy has been arrested for carjacking a woman, and that woman works at your company. Wouldn't you know it?" The carjacking had taken place around the same time as his interview. The cop saw the company name and the guy's name and warned us, and I'm so grateful he did. At the time, I was a makeup artist that was flying to New York to work with a photographer. Right before the trip, communication dropped off completely. He wouldn't respond to Instagram or calls or emails either. A few weeks later, happened to catch his name in the paper. He had been arrested for a crime so awful that the narrator can't even say it on YouTube. Yep. Take it from me, folks, we can at least say the words for most of the world's crimes and offenses here, although we have to dance a little bit around the wording of ones where flirting goes way too far or the unspeakable act. But this one, I can't even talk about the subject matter in the most abstract terms. Suffice to say, it's sickening and awful, and this guy deserves to go away forever. Good resume. Former military, we were going to call him for an interview, but Googled him first. Turns out he was arrested for arms trafficking. The report said he'd stolen 2 or 3 small arms as well as a Stinger missile system from the base he was stationed at. The people he set up to sell the stuff to were undercover officers. I just asked the other manager if he remembered that guy's name so I could find the report. He didn't, but he reminded me that some of the stuff that was listed as being in his possession was a number of flak jackets and a Humvee. Years ago at my previous company, a few co-workers met a young man interested in a software development position with us at a local trade conference and invited him to come interview with us later that afternoon. Said fellow eagerly provided the link to his blog. Top post was about being recently released on probation after a stint for illicit substance sales and how his upstream supplier was kind enough to front him some startup capital and some new inventory to resume his little side gig, as his previous stash was allegedly confiscated during a previous visit by law enforcement. Co-workers and I decided to read a few more posts just to make sure we didn't confuse this guy with the wrong person and inadvertently got the wrong link to his blog or something. Sure enough, a few photos and some older posts confirmed it was the same guy. We didn't manage to get much additional work done for the rest of the afternoon between speculation as to when his apparent commitment to full public disclosure would land himself back in the clink and whether we ought to even mention having checked out his blog. We all had to try very hard to keep a straight face when he did come in for his interview. He actually was very reasonably knowledgeable when it came to the job, and somehow we'd managed to completely avoid the question of his side gig in recreational pharmaceutical sales. We gave him an A+ for honesty and an F for good sense. He was not extended an offer of employment. There was a time I was screening tenant applications for a room for rent. I had a bad roommate experience before, and I wanted to make sure I got the right fit for a tenant. I was exchanging emails with this nice lady who was eager to move. I explained to her the process and that a background check was needed to be done by our property manager. But I had this weird gut feeling about this lady, so I googled her name, and a bunch of arrest records popped up, including domestic disputes. That was a no for me, and I politely declined her application. I share my dad's name, so when you Google my name, you pull up his exploits, stuff like being arrested for having 7 semi-trucks worth of green herb in his driveway. Thanks, Dad. Had a guy come in to apply for a dumper truck job. Seemed okay, very well spoken, clean cut, not the kind you see usually applying for a job driving a dump truck. He told me he had a PhD in psychology and had his own DWI and addiction counseling business, but his wife divorced him and he lost everything. So I googled him. He wasn't lying, but the story went a bit deeper than that. Turns out his wife had been cheating on him. When he found out where the boyfriend lived, he snorted almost enough white snow to give himself a heart attack, went to the guy's house where his wife's car was parked. He shot 30 rounds from an automatic weapon into the house and the car with them inside the house. Somehow he got off with only 6 months in jail and probation. He didn't get the job. I suppose you wouldn't hire him. How can you trust someone you can't even hit with a full mag to correctly meet all of his goals for that one job? We hired an ex-policeman as a technician in our trade field. He seemed willing and able, and he passed stringent background and driving backgrounds. He said he was wanting to be out of law enforcement because of the scrutiny officers were under and needed a career change. This guy looked like a cop. Anyway, he worked for a couple of months and did okay at his role, until we got a call saying he'd blacked out behind the wheel, crossed several lanes and medians and wrecked his company truck into a tree, and finally a house. We went to pick him up and assess the damage. The firefighters agreed it might be due to dehydration and no charges were filed. Then we Googled his name. This officer had been charged with DUI in the middle of the day a year prior for wrecking his cruiser in basically the same way. On that day, paramedics discovered he confessed to drinking whiskey all day during his patrol. The guy was an extreme but functioning alcoholic. Luckily, he was still inside his 90-day probation period, so termination was simple. The guy sent me his resume, but instead of sending it as an attachment, he emailed me a snapshot of his resume he'd stored in his photos. In the photos below it was him smoking doobies and drinking 40s with his friends. And no, I'm not against green herb or booze. My main priority is to protect the company, and the job entailed driving company vehicles, machinery, operating equipment, stuff like that. I can't knowingly hire someone who'll fail a P-test if he crashes, as the insurance company won't pay it. He was dismissed because he emailed me with a screenshot from his phone as a resume, not as an attachment. Also, his email said, "Hey, I saw this job on Craigslist. My number is this. I live here. Can I start ASAP? HMU." That was word for word, by the way. He was so well-spoken, he had big dreams, was tech-savvy. I was about to hire him on the spot. A Google search pulled up a mugshot for identity theft. We didn't hire him. I was interviewing a chef for my business. The interview went great. He had an excellent resume. Worked at some of the top restaurants in the world, 3 Michelin star kind of places, even did a short cooking test with some spare ribs, and they were incredible. There was some stiff competition though, so eventually we decided to look at everyone's Facebook profiles. One of his old profile pics was him at Mardi Gras parade dressed as Pikachu with a big adult toy strapped on his front. So yeah, he got the job. I was head of HR for an answering service company at one point in my life. Staff turnover was atrocious, and most of the resumes that came through were from people that had 0 job history or were chronic job hoppers. Imagine my surprise when Renee's resume crossed my desk. With the exception of a 10-year gap on her resume, she appeared to be an ideal candidate. Then I found the articles from a newspaper about 2 hours away. That 10-year gap? Serving time for kidnapping and murder. With an axe. A literal frickin' axe murderer. I hired her, and as far as I know, she's still there. Model employee, strong work ethic, positive attitude. 10 out of 10 would hire an axe murderer again. We were narrowing the group down to 2 or 3 candidates. We then Googled, Facebooked, and LinkedIn'd them to get to the one that was in the top 2. Their Facebook was completely open to the public to view everything. Lots of racist, sexist comments, and risque photos of them in some highly compromising positions. That was too bad. Their resume was actually pretty good. Just not something we'd consider appropriate for us. Police officers who had to arrest other police officers? What's the story? I'm a county deputy sheriff. I actually had to arrest 3 separate members of the justice system in 2020. First, a practicing lawyer and former judge who had been utilizing his position to coerce bedroom favors from the defendants. He utilized this leverage even after he wasn't a judge anymore. Investigation by DCI revealed that he had about a dozen victims, so a warrant for his arrest was made, which I executed. Arresting a guy you used to put defendants in front of is a very odd feeling. He weaseled out of prison time and got it all suspended and put on a direct supervision probation program, which is absolute horse crap. I've seen guys do way less and get way more time, but it's not really a secret that money has a habit of tipping the scales of justice, is it? Next was a prison guard who attacked his girlfriend, then stalked her relentlessly. I actually arrested him twice after he posted bail on the first time because he was spotted lurking outside her home only 45 minutes after being released. He's currently on felony assault, strangulation of a household member, felony violation of a protection order. He's still in my jail awaiting trial with a bail that's been substantially increased. I'm anticipating prison time for him, but only time will tell. And the third was a city police officer because we received a call from a 6-year-old that his dad was in the garage doing substances and wouldn't come out. We showed up to find 4 very young kids running around unsupervised. It was a city police officer smoking crystal that he'd confiscated during a traffic stop and not reported or turned into evidence. DCI took the case from us due to potential conflict of interest and have placed him in another county's jail, and I haven't heard any more about it. I hope he does time too. What kind of monster leaves his little kids totally alone and unsupervised while they smoke crystal? Especially when said person is a frickin' cop. Unforgivable in my opinion. But yeah, 2020 has been a very strange year for me. My dad was the arresting officer of an undercover narcotics detective for the murder of 2 fellow officers. From what I remember, the 2 officers and a technician caught him by surprise while he was stealing from an evidence room. He shot the 2 officers first and then his weapon jammed, so the technician escaped. Detective got life in prison and died there. Can't go into too much detail, but I had to book in an officer for taking his female roommate's phone and then sending her personal undressed photos to his own phone. He then threatened to leak them unless she did bedroom favors for him, but she just called it in instead. And good for her. You have to hope that this was the last she heard of it. I know that some cops can take their colleagues being caught as a personal offense and go after the people who report it. So with any luck, maybe this guy was such a creep that the other officers just hated his guts as well. This was during my time as a United States Marine Corps MP. Never arrested another police officer during my other gigs. I got a phone call from a guy's wife saying he was drunk and refusing to leave the house. I knocked on the front door but found him crying on the porch about his wife leaving him because she wasn't happy anymore. She walked by the porch and motioned for me to come inside through the glass door. She proceeded to show me the red marks on her throat, the hole in the door that he'd punched through beside her head, and some other evidence that doesn't need to be disclosed. After asking him to come inside and get dressed, he refused to leave with me. I wasn't going to handcuff him in front of his kid, but he decided to take that moment to run from me. He was faster and got away for about 5 minutes before I found him walking through a playground a couple of buildings over. Caught up to him, he punched me, but was taken into custody after a slight use of force. On the way to the station, he tried to kick out a window in my cruiser and told me I was ruining his life. He ended up getting charged with about 7 different charges and was kicked out of the Marines. On his way out, he lied to NCIS and got an investigation opened on me for the unspeakable act. Investigation was completed thoroughly and all charges against me were marked as unsubstantiated, but the charges still showed up after I got out and went through a background check for my security clearance. 10 out of 10 would do it again anyway. My slight inconvenience was totally worth it to get that monster out of his household. My dad was a cop. He was still working as a full-time cop before switching full-time to firefighting and made a traffic stop at around 11 at night in the mid-80s. A nicer car, speeding well over the limits, so my dad initiates a stop. Before he's out of his cruiser, the driver has what looks like a badge hanging out of the window. My dad walks up, does the usual song and dance, and the driver said, "You obviously can't frickin' see who I am." And my dad says, "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, I do, and right now I'm conducting a traffic stop." Turns out the driver was a lieutenant colonel in the Ohio State Highway Patrol, which is pretty high up in their rank structure. My dad again asks him for license and insurance, and the guy goes off. Threatens to call the governor at the time and threatens his job, that he was just trying to get back to Columbus after an engagement, and so on and so forth. Eventually, my dad calls for backup and has another officer there to witness what's going on. Eventually, my dad writes him a ticket, and while still screaming, Mr. Pulling Rank drives away. The next shift, my dad gets called in by his assistant chief and is asked about the stop, and apparently the colonel of OSHP was calling him in about it. In the end, they had to bring in the other officer to write a statement of what went on, and in the end, nothing came of it except the ticket wasn't contested and paid. Probationary officer goes on a blind double date with his roommate. Been at the racetrack drinking, so they take the train to downtown. Everyone is pretty drunk, him in particular. Maybe to entertain or show off for his date, he's acting goofy. As everyone's getting off the train, he sees some guy bent over tying his shoe. Rocket scientist decides to leapfrog over the guy, only neither of them have much balance. Probationary cop basically jumps over/on the guy and drives his face straight into the pavement because he's too drunk and the guy wasn't expecting it. Everyone jumps up and he starts trying to defuse the situation he's just caused. Turns out the guy is a 17-year-old kid heading down to spend the weekend with his grandparents and has 2 broken teeth and a broken nose. The drunk cop starts saying stuff like, "It's okay, it'll be fine, I'm a cop, it's all good." When he realizes the crowd isn't just going to let him walk away, he bails on foot and tries to run off. A few guys chase him down and grab him. The cops get called and detain him. I was the on-call detective who was called out at 10:30 at night to handle the case. He refused to answer any questions and was booked in for felony battery, based on the extent of injuries and the age of the victim. He never made it off probation and just had to resign. I wrote up and submitted the packet to the DA for prosecution. Nothing was swept under the rug? Trust me, a guy like this is not wanted in the police department. He was a probationary officer, so it would be easier to terminate him. The case was put through the system by the DA, and he ultimately took a plea deal. A plea deal is very common across the entire spectrum of cases, whether it be a vandalism, theft of $1 billion, drug charges, or murder. It's probably the most commonly used tool for adjudicating cases, so I don't think a plea deal was arranged because he had been a cop. Remember, he was arrested and charged by the same department he was a probationary officer for. Former police officer and correctional officer here. I never actually arrested a fellow cop myself. However, my field training officer was arrested and fired from my former department twice for drunk and disorderly conduct before I worked there. He got his job back twice through the union arbitration and, to his credit, gave up drinking. Then when I was working at the jail, we had a cop who was put into protective custody and watch in case he tried to self-delete after being arrested for stalking a woman he met on call. He got obsessed with her and kept bothering her after the fact, and after she reported him, he made threats against her. We had 7 officers at the jail beat a disabled inmate and then lie about it on their reports. The shift commander then tried to erase the video. Everyone was fired and arrested, but were later acquitted of all charges. Sad thing was, they were all guilty as hell. I got a call one night about a domestic. Upon arrival, this woman was bleeding heavily from her face. She said her boyfriend was a cop and he was in the next room. We talked to him and he tells us how she deserved it. Had to use force on him and get him in custody. Guy had close to 8 years inside, fired on the spot by IAD when they arrived. F him. I have no sympathy for that kind of monster. Yeah, I for one am very glad he wasn't smart enough to try and obfuscate it in any way. That kind of guy needs to be off the streets as quickly as possible and shouldn't be in charge of dealing with similar civilian cases. Ex-sheriff's deputy here. One night on shift, I had the great misfortune to overhear on the radio that a small local chief of police, whose department was only 3 people, was not answering a radio call. So, my shift partner goes out to the call that they're trying to get him to go to, and I make my way to try and locate this chief of police. On my way to the police station, thinking maybe he's asleep on the couch, I see his squad car pulled off onto the side of the road, lights going. In that moment, my heart sank. My first thought was, oh no, this guy just got killed in a traffic stop. As I'm walking up to his car in a hurry, I notice that he's slumped over. I reach into the open driver's window and grab his shoulder to try and put my fingers against his neck to feel if he has a pulse or if his skin is still warm, and generally check to see if he's still in fact alive. As I'm doing this, I notice a distinct and strong odor of alcohol. As the chief of police wakes up, looks at me, puts the car in drive and pulls away. About that time, another deputy pulls up behind my car and I put on my radio that the chief is driving off. The other deputy, forgetting that we all use a shared frequency, then comes over the radio and says he should be easy to follow because his lights are on. The lights go off. Fast forward to several hours later, command staff is out at the police department seizing the weapons and evidence that are stored within the department. This chief of police shows up with the mayor of the small town and submits himself to a breathalyzer. He barely passes. Fun fact, district attorneys do not like prosecuting chiefs of police, especially when politics are starting to get involved. Unrelated to that, I was let go about 2 weeks later for calling a suspect a butthole. Unprofessional conduct charges. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I saw a true crime video where this police officer killed his ex because she was trying to divorce him and she had really nice life insurance. He was struggling really hard with bills, and apparently the crime split the whole police department up. People who thought he was guilty versus people who couldn't believe it and thought he wasn't. The side that was on his side were co-workers for years. They simply couldn't believe that someone they'd worked with all that time could do that. He had a good rep at work, but at home he was different. In the end, he was caught because he was the only one who had keys to the car that she drove, and the police found a paper with calculations on it that were how much money he'd have left over after the life insurance paid off his debt in his house. This evidence was pretty much the last missing factor because the cops had a very hard time building a case because he'd covered his tracks pretty well, plus he made sure he had a strong alibi. He honestly would have gotten away with it. In the beginning, he was very helpful and gave as many statements as the cops needed. But the more evidence the cops were picking up, the more he started resisting and wasn't complaining anymore. He was actually pretty awful towards her, but she was the main breadwinner of the household. She got tired of it and was trying to move on and settle the divorce as calmly and nicely as possible, but he wasn't complying. It got to the point where he'd break in at the house whenever he wanted, plus he'd leave her recorded messages on the home phone. Since she was a nurse, she recorded all calls because sometimes her patients would call her and ask questions. But when the cops searched her place, they thought it was very weird how those tapes from his calls were missing. After all, he had a key. Plus, the murder was done in her work parking lot, and his alibi was strong, but it seemed very plotted. On top of that, they did get a confirmation he rented a van. The same-looking van that the killer jumped into after he killed her at the parking lot. Police couldn't trace the license plate because they were going off by the cameras from the car dealership across the street. It was too far to get a clear reading of it. Oh, and he had a very good reputation at work, but he also had a crap ton of circumstantial evidence against him. Oh, and he was sleeping around with a co-worker. My grandfather was a police officer. He was a colonel of the military brigade, I think Coronel de Polícia Militar in Portuguese. We're from north of Brazil, and in the 1960s, in my state's countryside, conflict with Native American people was very common. My grandfather told me the titular officer of the city was capturing Timbira people, protesting for their land, and torturing them. I remember him specifically saying something about kicking tied-up people in the backs until they bled, putting salt on the wounds, and stepping on them with military boots. That detail stuck with me. The thing is, my grandfather's grandmother came from this aldeia, I don't know the right term in English. The same ethnicity, same city, so he had a more sympathetic view of the Native American people, more than the typical Brazilian police officer from the 60s. He saw what the police force was doing in that city, and when he got called for supervising the conflict, he arrested the guy because he was doing that stuff to men, women, and children. The guy was demoted, some other guy came with the same approach, and absolutely nothing changed. That's what my grandfather told me. I don't know if it's true, but it's very plausible in the scenario that I know of in Brazil. I'm sorry for my broken English, by the way. I'm an actual cop, so I'll give an answer. I've arrested 12 cops for DUI, 2 of which included charges of possessing weapons while intoxicated. I've arrested 1 cop for writing a check on a closed account, another for violating a protection order during a very ugly divorce. I assisted the feds on a couple of tax-related arrests. I've also arrested a total of 3 cops for dereliction of duty. One of those cops was a cop who didn't arrest or conduct a DUI investigation after a crash involving another cop. All of these cases proceeded in a very similar fashion as other people with similar backgrounds and criminal records would have had with similar offenses. The slap on the wrist is actually very common and the norm with first-time offenders. Also, the things I found cops arrested for are generally the same things other middle-class, blue-collar workers get in trouble for. Issues with substance overuse, particularly alcohol, and financial problems. My career is perfectly fine. I've faced absolutely no negative repercussions from any of my peers. I'd say if you work for a large enough agency, you've probably arrested or written a ticket to a cop. And yeah, I'm guessing that the larger your precinct is, the better protected you are from crooked cops who'd try to get you back. Much more oversight and a moving roster of incoming and outgoing cops. So they likely don't build up quite the same old boys club mentality that certain small offices do, although I'm sure some of them have bad batches of guys. If both cops try to arrest the other at the same time, is there a double arrest or a cancellation? Actually, there's cases like this. In New Jersey, a state trooper pulled over an unmarked, haggard minivan with a bunch of armed men in it. The trooper approaches the vehicle with his hand on his weapon, and when someone starts to get out, he actually draws his weapon. The people in the van aren't wearing uniforms or displaying any sort of identification, but they're wearing vests and carrying firearms. What happens can only be described as state trooper frickin' owns idiot county police that almost get themselves shot. There was a screaming match between the trooper and the county cops, with the latter being really angry that the trooper drew his weapon and held it low and ready until he could positively ID these guys as officers. The trooper goes back to his vehicle, I'm sure thinking that this is going to be a really crappy day, and one of the county police hasn't had enough and starts to aggressively walk towards the trooper, who again draws his weapon and holds it at his side. County cop is beyond indignant about this and actually begins trying to chest bump the trooper, who other than himself tossing a few choice words into the conversation, remains professional as can be expected when you just pulled over a van full of guys claiming to be county police narcotics squad conducting an operation on one of the major substance routes into and out of the county. I could be getting some of these details wrong, but it was the craziest thing I've ever read about. The trooper and the county cop, chest to chest, screaming at each other on camera, with one incredibly hot-headed county guy even throwing out some threats. I think the county guys ended up getting in some hot crap, and everyone but the county police department backed the trooper and said he was in the right, and the county guys almost got themselves shot. One I remember was a trooper that rear-ended a lady, and when he got out of the car to talk to her, his shirt was on inside out, untucked and disheveled. As he was talking to her at her vehicle, a beer bottle cap falls out of his shirt, and then he drops a magazine and a loose round. At that point, the lady was calling 911, and some other troopers start showing up. They do their duty and arrest him, but everyone is recorded saying that it's a shame it's already been called in and the call recorded, and there's camera footage from the other troopers responding. There's a video of a rear-facing camera after he's put in the car, and he looks out of his mind drunk. I think they ended up taking him to hospital because he claimed his absurd behavior was the result of having been put under for prostate surgery earlier that day. Which makes no sense because they don't let you drive off if you've been heavily sedated or totally knocked out, especially with your shirt all messed up and magazines falling out of your duty belt and pockets. Not me, but an uncle. Arrested an officer from another city for drunk driving, claiming to be the head of that city's police department. The actual head officer for that offending officer is my other uncle, the first uncle's brother, who was actually sitting in my uncle's patrol car before the off-duty police officer was tagged. The UK has a documentary series called 24 Hours in Police Custody. Series 6, Episode 1 covered Bedfordshire police investigating a blackmail case, where it turned out that one of the DCs working the case was actually the suspect. Incredible episode and well worth a watch if you can find it. The DC's name was Gareth Suffling and he was given a 3-year prison sentence. Not a cop, but a former dispatcher who filed a complaint against another dispatcher for jeopardizing public and officer safety. This person did not like me and would intentionally withhold information and not enter it into CAD, causing me on the radio to have delays in responding to other questions. When I'd finally had enough and reported this person to the assistant chief, I was sent home. 2 days later, I was fired for abandoning my post, even though I never left. I called both the chief and the assistant chief out during my termination for this being a case of good old boys and collected my personal belongings. To this day, people ask me all the time why it is that when they call 911 at this particular city, they get told to hold. My response is usually that the dispatcher is most likely finishing their game of Candy Crush first. The thin yellow line of dispatchers and the thin blue line of cops are to never be crossed. You're either with them or against them. I'm a cop for a medium-sized police department. I've arrested 2 officers for operating while intoxicated. One of them was from my department. I arrested a lieutenant for domestic attacks and 1 more officer for retail fraud. I never faced any backlash and I wasn't fired or written up. Wow, back-to-back stories of 2 very different responses to the individual good workers doing their jobs and making difficult calls against their fellow officers. Just goes to show you can't know if your colleagues in this sort of job will back you up on the correct call or close ranks and protect their own from charges anyone else would be in deep crap for. I worked as a contractor for a law enforcement's digital evidence lab. There was a new guy who'd just retired as a cop but came on because apparently he wanted to do computer forensics and supposedly had some background in it. We were training together, learning about cell phone forensics, when he missed a day of training. That night, he was on the news because he'd been arrested after cops closed in on him for soliciting pictures from inappropriately aged people. We weren't part of the investigation bit, but did send his work computer over to the lab that was working on it, and he had some of the worst stuff you can imagine. Overall, we were shocked, but also couldn't not chuckle at the irony that he was a computer forensics analyst who didn't know how to hide evidence on a computer. My case was just domestic violence. Not much of a story, pretty clear cut. Luckily, it was a visiting family, so not someone I knew. Other than that, I once tackled a guy who'd been fighting in a bar and threw cuffs on him, only to find out later he was a cop. I should have known when he immediately put his hands behind his back when I told him to do so, instead of fighting me as most drunks tend to do. Detained, but I didn't arrest him because I actually didn't see him punch anyone, and disorderly conduct has a lot of discretion involved, and I didn't know who started it. Gave both parties the information needed to file charges against the other, and a report was completed. Just a reminder that an arrest is not supposed to be a punishment. Being charged with a crime is the issue. I think DUI is the most common thing against other cops, though. I never did much traffic enforcement. I was once reading about how sometimes a wife will leave a cop husband to go to a women's shelter. The problem is that cops know all the shelters in the area, so sometimes they have to be sent a couple of counties over under top secrecy. I arrested 4 separate officers during my career. All 4 were unspeakable act offenders. To be fair, special victims were my forte, and internal investigations fell under my title, so it just shook out that way. People who are pretty sure they've encountered a serial killer? What happened? Traveling out of state for a vacation with my kids, at a gas station, this one guy starts trying to talk to my young daughter. I immediately got between them, but not before my daughter blurted out exactly where we were going and how long we'd be there. I suddenly felt sick with worry. Something about the guy scared me. I just knew there was going to be a problem. I hustled the kids back to the car and waited to drive away out of fear he might follow us. I didn't see him come out, so eventually I drove off, but I was paranoid about it afterwards. 2 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone banging aggressively on our door. He was screaming that he was there with the security for the complex and that there was an intruder seen in the area, so I was required by law to open the door. Obviously, I didn't fall for that. He started swearing and threatening me. Then he just stopped. Suddenly, something spooked him and he turned and bolted. He'd been standing kind of off to the side and reaching over to bang on the door in a way where I couldn't see his face. When he moved, I saw it. It was the guy from the gas station. He had followed us through 2 states. The actual security of the complex drove around but never found him. There was a broken gate next to the condo that they said he got in through. It scares me so badly when I think about how I was on high alert and still didn't notice him until he was on my doorstep. I ended the trip early and never saw or heard anything else. But my daughter had nightmares about him breaking into our home for years. I was camping with a group of friends and exploring some rock climbing cliffs. The instructions for how to get there weren't great, and we ended up down a road with a farmer stopping us from going any further. Something didn't feel right about the whole encounter, pretending not to know about any landmarks despite clearly being a local, and really insisting that we didn't drive down the road further. We could have murdered our friend ourselves when he said, "Oh yeah, we're just camping at this exact spot here on the map." Even more so when someone pulled up in a van that night to our solo spot and sat in it, engine running, headlights on for 10 minutes. It turned out to be other campers, but my god. Oh, the guy telling the story was my uncle. His manager at the fast food place where he worked in high school invited him and another kid over to his place after work. My uncle and his friend declined and were very glad they did when years later it became public what exactly his former manager, John Wayne, second name Gacy, was doing to and with those other people he invited over. That's not dodging a bullet, that's dodging a frickin' nuke. I'm glad your uncle declined. My grandmother had 3 husbands die of food poisoning accidentally. I don't believe it for a second. Maybe she's just an awful cook. Well, although the latter is possible and morbidly funny, I guess the more probable ones are that it's a sickening, heartbreaking coincidence, or that the original author does indeed have a serial killer in the family. Let's hope that it's sad, sad happenstance. My stepdad was a truck driver, so often we'd visit him at a local truck stop when he was near to grab breakfast and other stuff. My mother is not great. During one of those adventures, my mum decided she wanted us to stay with my stepdad in the truck. Sister was 11, I was 9. During this 2-week period, we were in a random truck stop in Georgia. My sister and I went to go take a shower because we hadn't for days and shared a shower to save on money. I was in and out and waited in the hallway for my sister. A man came up to me and started asking questions. This was happening in the early 2000s, so I'd been taught stranger danger, but also was still being taught to always be respectful to adults. Bullcrap. I was giving him basic answers, but then he was showing me his truck. My tiny self was terrified, but I kept saying, no, I can't. Eventually, he got annoyed and just grabbed my arm and started pulling. In that moment, my sister came out and snatched me back and we ran, crying to tell my mum. I was called overdramatic. If my sister hadn't seen me, I'm positive I would never have been seen again. Oh, I coached the guy's kids' soccer team for years. His kids were fun-loving goofballs that had 2 left feet. He was worried that people would pick on them. Once he stuck around to offer support when we had a parent acting up because the guy was huge. My kids were in his wife's class in elementary school. She was a really nice lady. She left town and no one heard anything from her after he was arrested for attacking working girls. A friend of mine mentioned one of his aunts still has love letters from school that Richard the Night Stalker Ramirez sent to her. It's just so crazy that someone going about their life has no idea that they've encountered a future murderer. I dated Alaskan serial killer Joshua Allen Wade's father for a bit prior to everything coming to light. I've actually been alone in the house with that kid, and that was terrifying after the fact. While I was at university, I worked at a cafe in a local shopping center. Some of our regular customers were a mum and a son who'd come to have breakfast most mornings. The mum was delightful, however the son always seemed a bit off. Nothing major, just you'd say, "Have a great day," and he'd reply with, "Yes." Anyway, one day he comes in without his mum and has his breakfast. The next day his face is all over the news as he's just been arrested for doing in his poor old mum. So this has actually definitely encountered a serial killer rather than pretty sure. I grew up in a small town in North Wales in the UK. The local cinema had been closed for 15 years, but a guy from out of town had reopened it. As kids, this blew our mind as it was a rural area with very little to offer in terms of entertainment, so it seems unbelievable to us that we'd actually have a cinema in town. On one visit to the cinema, I ended up needing to use the toilet during a film, so I left the theater. I walked through the foyer and into the toilet. There was no paper there, so I went back into the foyer and spoke to the cinema owner to ask if he had any loo roll. I was younger than 10 at the time and very nervous about speaking to adults, but the owner was incredibly kind and friendly and gave me the toilet paper, and we had a conversation about the film and how happy I was that we now had a cinema in our town. I used the toilet and then went back to the theater. A few weeks later, the friendly cinema man was on the front page of every newspaper. He was Peter Moore. My story takes place in Ohio. I paid him to remove a problematic tree that I wasn't confident about cutting down without it dropping on my home. He convinced me to save the tree and just remove a few limbs that were dangerous. He seemed like a nice dude. A month later, he took out everyone in a house except one who he abducted. He stuffed the bodies of the other 3 into the hollow of a tree. When his home was later searched, it was full of piles of leaves and wallpapered to look like trees, and the abducted individual was locked in the basement. Ugh. Well, my guy wasn't when I met him, to be fair. I worked a retail job that sold iPhones at a high-end mall. A guy comes in carrying a Nordstrom bag, wearing Gucci sunglasses, and asks to buy an iPhone. While I waited for our back-of-house team to bring the phone, I was making casual conversation with the guy. I ask what he does for work. He says he's an actor. I ask if he's been in anything I might have seen, and he says, The Hunger Games. I say, cool, who did you play? He mumbles something about being one of the tributes. Conversation somehow leads to him asking if I'm single. I told him I was engaged, and he was visibly annoyed. His attitude got very arrogant after that, and he did a lot of uncomfortable, creepy staring that I noticed after he took off his sunglasses. I'd initially asked him if he was eligible for an upgrade on his phone, and he was confident that he was. Well, after checking his ID, standard protocol, and pulling up the account, nope, not eligible, but his brother's phone was eligible. He insists that he can use his brother's upgrade, but I tell him that stuff like this needs to be approved by the main account holder or another authorized user. So he calls his stepmom and asks to use the brother's upgrade. His stepmom says no, and the guy throws a complete tantrum. Says that his brother is too young for an iPhone anyway, and that he's fine using an older model, that he needs a new phone. Stepmom doesn't budge, yet I'm stuck there for at least 20 minutes while this guy yells at his stepmom, trying desperately to get his way. He leaves in a huff, and I'm so relieved to get away from this entitled jerk. The guy was Elliot Rodger. I've been unable to confirm if he was in any of the movies, but his dad was a producer on the films. I ended up reading his manifesto where he talked about frequenting the mall that I worked at, and how he was also very envious of the actors in the Hunger Games when attending the premiere with his family. I'm assuming he thought that lying about being an actor in the movie would make him sound impressive to me. My uncle was 16 and decided to hitchhike home. A guy pulls over and he gets in. Immediately the guy locks the car doors. As they're going along, this dude driving is getting pretty creepy, saying things like, "We could go to the airport and I'll fly you anywhere you want." My uncle is very freaked out at this point and waits for his moment. He pulls the lock and jumps out at a light and takes off running. He says the guy started following him, but by going through alleys and stuff he was able to shake him off. After he gets home, my grandma could tell something was wrong, so she asked him what happened. He admitted to hitchhiking and told Grandma what the guy had done and said. Grandma got a baseball bat and they drove around town looking for the guy but didn't find him. It wasn't too much later that they arrested him and the story broke. My mum rode her bike over and watched them take the bodies out from down the block, or so she says. In short, my uncle had accepted a ride from John W. Gacy. He wasn't supposed to be hitchhiking, but it was the 70s. At some point, he got a bad vibe and jumped out at a red light. When Gacy was arrested, he put 2 and 2 together. And that was our second story about Gacy. I wonder if we'll have any more by the end of this. As someone who just Googled what it was that this guy actually did, I sincerely hope we don't run into him again. Although I guess since most of these people are terrible, I guess that it wouldn't be saving me from too much of the ick factor. My mom once told us about a suspected run-in she had with Clifford Olson. She was about 13 years old, walking home from a swim club, and a man matching his description pulled up alongside her and tried to strike up a conversation. He'd ask her where the post office was located and said he needed some help mailing a present. My mum was smart enough to realize it was Labor Day and the post office was closed. She saw he had plates on his car from the US and had leather gloves on. When she finally worked up the courage to end the conversation and walk away, the man started swearing at her, telling her to get in the car, and then he sped off. The dates and location all add up too. It was freaky stuff. I asked my mum for more information, but she pretty much told me the same story. She ran off the sidewalk into a park across the street to get away from him and didn't stop until she got home. She never reported it to the police, but told my grandparents about the encounter. She wasn't allowed to walk home from the swim club anymore, and the parents set up a carpooling program for the group. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. My grandmother. This was in Florida. She told me about how this man came up to her way back in the day saying he was injured and needed help. He was wearing a bright yellow shirt, not related, but I remember her pointing that out to me. She told him that she was really sorry, but she was in a rush to go because she was going to meet her sister to make plans for an upcoming family gathering they'd planned. So she couldn't be of assistance and pointed him in the direction of the nearest doctor's office. And just like that, she left. Turns out the guy was Ted Bundy. She said the look in his eye was the most sinister thing she had ever seen and that she almost helped him, but decided against it at the last minute. My grandmother was an amazing woman. She was always helping people and saw the good in everyone, but she just said he had an evil look in his eye that she couldn't ignore. Robert Lee Yates was an army pilot flying OH-58s while I was flying UH-1s. Same battalion but different company, at Fort Drum, New York. They'd send us down to fly helicopter simulators once a year in Pennsylvania to maintain our instrument ratings. We'd carpool in one vehicle. Bob had a van with shag carpet in the back, so we'd chuck about 5 of us in there during those trips. It was a 4-hour drive, so we'd joke and tell stories to pass the time. I was a fairly new pilot who enjoyed hearing the veteran pilots tell stories. Bob was a CW3 at the time and was a bit odd, but nothing alarming. 18 years later, we saw him on TV being charged with multiple murders of working girls across several states. He had used a Corvette and van for his deeds. Yep, that same van. My grandparents took me on a road trip and stopped in Shreveport to gamble. I sat on a bench and read for hours. It sounds crappy, but my attention span wasn't completely fried at that point, and I was happy to read as long as anyone would let me. Another kid a couple of years younger was in the same situation, but he was not a reader. We started talking and eventually he started telling me about the neighborhood animals he's done awful things to. Cats, dogs, wild animals. He was an equal opportunity monster. He might have just been trying to impress a stranger. He might currently have a crawl space packed with bodies. Who knows? A few months ago, my mother took my son, who was about 6 at the time, to get Santa photos done. A few months later, Toronto police arrested Santa. He had killed several men. He ran a landscaping company and was hiding the bodies in the ground and planting potters of jobs he was doing. Also, working as a mall Santa. Thing that's messed up to me is I'm aware of his actions, but somewhere a family has a photo of their child on his lap, completely unaware, full-fledged serial killer on display. When I was 12 or 13, there was a string of kidnappings and killings in my area. We were told to be very careful. They also gave us a very vague description of the murderer. The very insignificant traits they knew of was that he had a darker complexion and 2 pale scars on his face, on each side of his eyes. One day after school, I took the subway to get to the place where my mother used to work. It's in the edges of the city. It's not a busy area, so the subway wasn't crowded at all. I was waiting for my stop when I noticed a guy sitting 10 meters from me. He was wearing a hoodie, but I could still see part of his face, and one of the things I noticed were 2 pale scars similar to what they'd described. He also had a darker complexion. As soon as I saw that, I immediately stopped looking and I got off at the next stop, trying to look as calm as possible. It was scary because I was close to the age and description of his victims. I'm definitely sure I've had one of these chats because my cousin is one of these. We were quite close before it was revealed to me and the rest of the family that he was a monster, and our last encounter was in September 2020, when he hugged and consoled me at my dad's viewing. His death wasn't related to the cousin. Roughly 6 weeks later, he killed his final victim and was arrested 2 weeks after that. That's when we all found out the truth about him. He also referred to my brother as his little buddy, and they were particularly close, which now makes me so angry because my brother's on the spectrum, as was his final victim. 2 of the others had unspecific learning difficulties. I also set him up with a close friend of mine who fits in his victim pool, but thank God he didn't kill her. I assume it's because that would have been too close to home to get away with. I had an employee that worked for me doing minor maintenance repairs on construction equipment. One day, it just took him way too long on a job, and I was angry. I pulled the GPS info, and he was nowhere near where he was supposed to be. My admin and I both called him repeatedly with no response. Then I was even more angry because this wasn't the first time he took too long or didn't answer his company-provided Nextel radio. We started digging, find out that it's happened recently. He gets back late, and I waited for him alone in my office. I terminated him, and he took it surprisingly well. Surprised me because I dealt with a ton of BS as a woman in a male-dominated field and company. A few years later, I was working in a different location for the same company, and some cops showed up and wanted to know what I remembered about him. I told them that I fired him. They subpoenaed the GPS records from the company. Then they started finding the rest of the bodies. He broke down and pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He'd been picking up working girls in the company truck, killing them and dumping the bodies in a rural part of the neighboring county. My God, and you, a woman in a male-dominated field, canned him? I'm really glad that you got out of this oblivious, although if you're anything like me, you probably would have needed a bit of a lie down on the floor after hearing about what he had been up to. I once sat in my car at the back of a country lane car park eating pizza in the dark with a friend. No streetlights and just woods surrounding us. Finished up and turned on the headlights, and all we could see was a man army crawling towards the car a few meters away. I've never turned on the ignition so fast and sped off in my life. To make it scarier, the guy just slowly got up and looked at us and didn't try to chase or grab the car or anything. Out of all the responses on this thread, yours just made my heart pound. That's terrifying. A guy offered to drive me to an abandoned building to do the deed. He said it was his favorite spot. As romantic as that sounded, I politely declined. My wife, then fiancé, and I were out in Brooklyn one night, reasonably drunk, and hailed a cab to go home. The moment I sat inside, I felt something was wrong. The car seemed more bare bones than a usual taxi, and the driver had a strange affect. There was also a slightly bad smell. The driver was kind of muttering under his breath and making those quiet burps. Every alarm inside of me started going off. I wasn't consciously analyzing it, I just knew it wasn't safe. The guy started driving maybe 10 feet, and when I stopped him and said, "Oh crap, I left my bag in the bar," I grabbed my wife and pulled her out of the cab. The driver started swearing and got unreasonably angry. Instead of, waiting a minute for us to return like a normal driver might, he immediately speeds off down the street. To this day, I'm convinced he was a serial killer or something like that, and that we narrowly avoided disappearing forever into the night. Not exactly a serial killer, but when I was about 7, my sister and I became convinced our neighbor was a serial killer because he was coming and going all hours of the night and constantly had his bathroom light on. My bedroom window had a view of the side of his house, so he wrote all of our evidence on my window with Expo markers. A few weeks after our investigation began, my dad was out front mowing the lawn early in the morning when the neighbor came out and asked him for a cigarette. My dad said he didn't have one, so the neighbor kept walking. A little while later, we heard sirens. There was a man who always walked his little wiener dog around the neighborhood, kind of a local celebrity. He was walking around the apartment complex 2 houses down from us when the neighbor saw him and shanked him to death. The guy never gave a motive aside from mental illness, but my dad's theory is that the neighbor really wanted a cigarette, and we all knew wiener dog guy smoked. So if wiener dog guy said no, that might have caused the neighbor to snap. He was arrested, but I believe he's getting out soon. So while he is a killer, whether or not he's a serial killer is TBD, I guess. My co-workers actually worked with a serial murderer and unspeakable act offender. They said he was quiet but nice, even went out to lunches with them sometimes. When he got arrested, one of them said they had to call the police. It couldn't be him, and that it had to have been a mistake. Nope, there was DNA evidence. To be fair, he did stop his crimes after he started working there. I met the murderer of Grace Millane. Not a serial killer, but on the day he was figuring out how to hide the body. So the night after he killed her, he came into the block of shops I was working at and was looking for a suitcase. He stopped by my store and asked and didn't buy anything, so went to the warehouse next to me. That week I got stopped numerous times going home as the police were looking for a shovel, eventually finding out the shovel was across from our store at the car wash as he had left it there. I even talked to the employee and was wondering why there was a muddy shovel left at one of his slots. You can see him on videos taking the suitcase into the elevator, which was bought in the store next to mine. The fact that he looked normal, acted normal, and bought all of these things still spooks me. You'd never know. Poor girl. I was at a shopping mall in LA when a man approached me saying he was a casting agent and photographer. Immediately I knew something was off with the guy because that's the #1 scam in the book. But he just gave off such a vibe that I instinctively knew he was very dangerous. I politely took his card and made a mad dash to the H&M and hid in the dressing stalls. I alerted a staff member and they had security walk me to my car. The gift of fear is real, you should trust it. About 2 months later, I had the news on in the background and I saw his face. He had been arrested for abducting and murdering someone from Michigan. He approached her the same way he did me. Scariest thing ever. I believe there's a new Dateline podcast series about it. I used to work in true crime television and I can't even listen to the podcast because it freaks me out of how close I was to this guy. As I said above, we have the gift of fear. For a long time, women were taught to be polite and ignore this even if uncomfortable. It's super important to trust your gut, and as MFM says, F politeness. What was the wildest thing that ever went down on your school bus? I have two. In middle school, my bus once caught fire a block away from the school. It was a tiny one, but enough to call the firefighters. We all piled off the bus and watched them do their thing. They bought a second bus, which also caught fire. Eventually, we were brought a third bus 30 minutes later. This was all during the winter, and we weren't allowed to walk back to the school because of safety reasons. Never understood why it was more safe to have kids standing outside in winter next to a bus on fire than walk them a block back to the school. The other time I was in first grade. My bus driver was a crazy nice guy. He knew all of us. One day, my aunt, who always picked me up, wasn't there at the stop. He said that I could stay on the bus and we would drive back after the route. Maybe she was just late. We drove back and she still wasn't there. So he asked me which house was mine. He drove us there and parked his bus. We rang the bell a bunch and threw small rocks at our window. Nothing. Her car was there though, so it was very weird. My friend's mum drove by and saw us. She offered to take me to her house so I could call my parents and stay there for a while even though it was her birthday. The bus driver left and said, "Don't worry, she's probably just asleep." Turns out she was eternally asleep and had had an aneurysm earlier that day. I'll never forget that day or the nice driver who wanted to make sure I was safe before he left. He even made sure to look out for me for the rest of the year. Great guy. Freshman year, a girl I was sitting next to opened her backpack and I saw a gat in it. She saw me see it and just gave me a hard glare and shook her head. I planted my eyes on the back of the seat in front of us and didn't even look at her for the rest of the ride. I went to a kind of rough school. 2 cops dressed in SWAT gear riding the bus with us. A man had apparently gone on a spree in our neighborhood. The scene apparently wasn't secure yet or something, so the cops had to ride with us while the driver dropped us off. I had a bus driver who would purposefully speed up when going over speed bumps so the kids could catch air. He got fired eventually for running into some garbage cans. I didn't have a bus driver who didn't do that. My last bus driver finally stopped after a fat kid had jumped a little too high out of his seat while going over a speed bump and got launched over 3 seats onto some girl. One time, our bus hit a car in a roundabout. The guy we hit was completely at fault. He must not have understood the turning radius of a bus or something. We were close to school and our bus driver was like, "Oh, well, I've got to deal with this." In case it wasn't obvious, I'm going to be doing all of the bus driver voices in my bad impersonation of Otto from The Simpsons. Yes, even the female ones. And yes, with regards to the last story, I'll admit that we probably shouldn't paint all drivers as the yellow rocker from Springfield, because if Otto was in that last story, there's no way he would have dealt with it responsibly, and he might not have even noticed he was in an accident to begin with. Our driver was such a cool and friendly guy. He was also pursuing a master's degree at the time. All of the kids on my school bus made a collective effort to buy him a Kindle at the end of the year because he was always reading, and it was the last year he'd be our bus driver. The student that organized it all gave it to him when she got on the bus. We had senior kids setting off smoke bombs and fireworks on the bus every frickin' year for a month before and after Halloween. A smoke bomb even landed on me and burned through my skirt once. When the bus drivers told them off, they used to just swear and act like they owned the place. Then one day we had a bus driver who just drove the bus to the police station when that crap started, and a few of the kids who were throwing the fireworks were crying when they got taken off the bus by the cops. The buses had CCTV too, so they couldn't even deny it. I was so glad when my older sister started driving and I could get lifts with her instead of going on the bus. A friend of mine when we were like 13 or 14 threw his orange peel in a small folder out the top floor window of a double-decker. Unbeknownst to him, a police riot van was underneath and they hit their windscreen. Two of the officers, dressed in riot gear, stopped the bus, stormed in and started fully screaming, no holding back, until my friend stepped forward and admitted the blame. They seemed unhinged, roaring at us relentlessly with threats of persecution. Turns out their bark reflected their bite, as the police ended up making an official complaint to the school and my friend got expelled for it. In 1995, my family moved away from where I grew up to another city as my dad changed jobs. I'd just graduated from elementary school, so I was starting high school in a new city. No friends, and this high school was 4 or 5 times the size of the one I was going to go to. We lived in the outskirts, so I rode the yellow bus. The very first day I got on the bus. There were 4 other guys and 1 girl that were on said bus when I got on. One of them immediately strikes up a conversation. I can tell this guy is a high-energy and loud dude. Quite the contrary to me. "Hey, what's your name?" I reply, "My name's James Medford." "James Medford? That name's too long. We need to give you a nickname." And in my head, I was fearing the worst. This guy was going to label me with a goddamn insulting nickname on my first day of school where I knew nobody. The next 5 years could be very long. Luckily, his intent was genuine, and he came up with the nickname Jim. Then he points to a guy sitting quietly across the aisle and says, "There's D. He's my brother. I think you guys are in the same grade. You guys should be friends." D looks up with a big smile with crooked teeth, a weird pair of thick glasses and says, "Hey, what's up?" He was tall for a teenager, pushing 6'2". We strike a little conversation up and discover we have many things in common. We're both into RPGs, Magic the Gathering, and things of the such. We were also both the youngest child of 3 boys. We related a lot. It was instant. We were buddies. A few months later, my family moves a little further out of town, which puts me on a different bus route, but I still attended the same school. When we moved to this place, for the first 2 months my bus ride was 2 hours long one way, so I'd get picked up at 6 a.m. and would only get home at 5:30 p.m. But that's an entirely different story. Fast forward to the summer of '96. I find out that D is moving away to a city a few hours away, so that means my best friend was no longer going to be at the same school as me. D and I completely lost touch. The internet was in its infancy and not everyone had email. We did snail mail a little, but that petered out after a few letters. Several months later, I think it was like April 1997, I get wind that a new kid will be coming to our school in our grade, and he'd be on my bus route. I knew what this kid was going through, moving to a new town, not knowing anyone, so I made a point that I'd be nice to him and help him make friends at school. So, the following Monday, the bus takes a different turn here and there, and we're driving down the street to go pick up this new kid. I look down the road and see this tall, lanky guy. As we pull up closer, it hits me. I know this guy. Yes, indeed, it was my best buddy D, who's back in town. We were both very excited that A, he was back in town, and B, the place he moved to was on the same bus route as me. Today, D and I are still best buds. He was my best man, and I was his best man. We see each other weekly. All of this because his brother gave me a nickname and told us we should be friends. I love you, D. In short, moved to a new city, met a new best friend, he moves away, a year later he moves back and we reconnect, and we're still best buds to this day 20 years later. Ah, that's so sweet. I'm not really in contact with any of my tiny wargaming or nerdy clique from school, so what you've got there is very special. I do wonder if that first guy you talked to was wingmanning his brother for friends, but you can't argue with the result. Once while picking up a kid, a dog got on the bus and everyone went nuts and started petting it. The driver eventually shooed it away. First day of my freshman year, a girl sitting across from me showed off her chest piercing. I always sat near the back of the bus from then on. I was in 5th grade, we all boarded the bus after school. Bus driver starts driving and we were rowdy. Bus driver screams, "Shut the F up!" several times. He starts yelling louder. We ignore him and then suddenly he slams on the brakes. We all fly around the bus. He parks it right there in the lane. He opens the door and walks away. We just watched him fade into the distance. Eventually, parents started showing up and we all got rides home. I'll never forget that bus ride. When I was in 6th grade, I moved from a really small town where I could walk to school every day to a much larger one where I had to ride the bus. I was having trouble finding my way around the school the first week and ended up running very, very late to catch the bus at the end of the day. I was already beating myself up about the fact that I was going to have to call one of my parents, who'd have to leave work early to pick me up. But when I got outside, the bus was pulled right up to the doors waiting for me. The bus driver knew I'd been on the bus that morning and verified with my brother that I was supposed to get on to go home. So he waited. I know it seems really insignificant, but with all the stress and anxiety I was feeling trying to settle into the new house, new city, and new school, it made a lasting impression on me. Thank you, Ron. My bus driver from age 4 through about 12 was absolutely crazy. This one road that we went up to was a big long hill that ended in a cul-de-sac, so we'd go all the way up and then circle back the same way we came. On the way down the hill on the way back, there was this bump in the road that would get really bad if it was cold and there was some water frozen under it. So during the winter, we'd beg her to hit the bump so we could get some air. She wouldn't say yes every day, but when she did, she'd speed down the hill, and when we hit the bump, I swear kids would literally hit the ceiling. I have such a distinct memory of turning around after impact and seeing a kid's back hit the top of the bus. She still has her job and is driving buses to this day. At Kids Stop, which was our after-school program for kids whose parents worked late, they had a van they'd use when taking us on small trips. Every time we went somewhere, we'd always go hit the dip in the road a few blocks away first. Every time Donna drove, she used to hit a little harder and we got some serious air in the back seat. One day, a kid chipped his tooth because of how violent the impact was. That was the end of that. Rumor had it the kid chipped his tooth on the ceiling. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I drove a school bus for students who were in the juvenile court system. They had been expelled by every standard school in the district and attended classes at juvie. They'd been through 6 bus drivers in the first 4 weeks of school when I received this school as my first assignment. I started 2 weeks prior. I was a retired Greyhound driver, so their crap wasn't anything I hadn't seen before. They thought they'd run off the other drivers, so I'd just be next if they screwed with me. There were only 12 students, but because of their school, it took about 3 hours to drop them off all over town. The general rule is when you pick up students in the AM, you start with the student furthest from the school and work your way there. In the PM, you drop off the closest first. The 2 students that should have been dropped off first were the worst behavioral cases. They'd throw stuff, scream and swear, and then laugh that they were getting off and too bad for me. I told them to clean up their torn-up paper, and they laughed and swore at me. I followed procedure and wrote them up to their principal. This meant nothing, they were already expelled, what else can they do? So, the next day I loaded the students, they started their crap, and I drove the morning route home. You know, furthest kid first. Man, the rest of them started screaming, "I'm gonna call my mama! I'm gonna get you fired!" I laughed. I told them their mum would appreciate that I kept them supervised for an extra 2 hours. Every time one of them acted up, they were the last to get off. If they complained about me turning the radio on, they got Dr. Laura or Sean Hannity. They stopped their bullcrap in a week. 6th grade, the driver stopped on a rural road and 2 sisters got out. The little one darted across the road and almost got hit by a car going 50 miles per hour that didn't stop. I can still feel the tension. 8th grade, a friend taught me how to gleek. Still one of my most useless talents. One day on the ride home in like 3rd grade, this kid Nick that lived in my neighborhood caused a ruckus and the bus driver turned around and pulled back into the school. The bus driver yelled and said, "All right, Mr. Wise Guy, what's your name?" Nick responded, "Nick." The bus driver asked, "What's your last name, Nick?" Nick said, "Elodian." Everyone laughed, but the bus driver didn't catch on. The principal came onto the bus and the bus driver said, "We've had a lot of fooling around on the bus and it was all started by Nickelodeon." We all cried laughing and our principal just shook her head and took Nick off the bus. I had a really big crush on this guy. I was staring longingly at him through the mirror above the bus driver, like dead-on creeper staring. Then he pointed or motioned towards me or something and I suddenly realized he can see me staring at him. Oh my god. And I felt like the stupidest person on earth. I was like a damn cat thinking I can see him in the mirror but he can't see me drooling at him. Gotta wonder how long that was going on before he'd finally had enough and decided to meet eye contact. Was this a one-ride special or had it been going on for months? It was the late 70s. I think I was in 7th grade. Our bus driver was a very cool guy everyone called Animal. The bus was an old one with a stick shift and clutch. Last day of school, Animal drives the bus to a nearby park and instructs all of us to go to the back of the bus. We all pile up in the last 3 or 4 rows of seats and he revs the engine and pops the clutch. The guy was popping wheelies in a school bus. Rumor has it he was banging the gym teacher too. Good times. My siblings and I went to a small private school that was about half an hour away from home. We were the only kids on the bus that went to that school, the rest got dropped off at a public school first, and we were the last off at night. Needless to say, we spent more time with the driver, Tom, than the other kids did, and he favored us. After all the other kids got off, he'd let us move around the bus, sweep the floor, or pick the radio station. At Christmas time, he'd share his treats that the other kids gave him as gifts. He was awesome. I'll always remember Tom, the bus driver. Waiting for the bus with a bunch of other kids in front of my apartment complex, saw a tabby cat get completely murked by a passenger car. Front wheels hit the cat got flung up against the wheel, hit the ground, then got smacked by the muffler. The driver immediately stopped and got out as the cat sprinted away. I figured the cat went off and died somewhere. After school that day, I went with a friend of mine over to the house of a friend of his, whom I didn't know. There I saw a tabby cat that looked identical to the one that got smoked in the street earlier. I asked him, "Is this your cat?" He replied, "Yeah, she got hit by a car today, but she seems okay." Not sure why this stuck with me, but this was during the cooler months where you'd just crack the window to get a bit of fresh air. We'd play football, the triangle paper kind, by kicking it back and forth. I kicked it one time and it went out the window. The window was only open far enough that it could barely slide through on the side. Then, the triangle flew back into the bus, 7 windows down, also through a window that was barely open enough to have it fit through. It hit a guy in the face. It was extremely bizarre. I had drunk lots of coffee the night before, trying to stay awake and study for a test. As I got on my bus the next morning, I start to get a real bad case of the squirts. But this is nothing I've never experienced before. 10 minutes into my 50-minute bus ride, I was starting to sweat. Then I panic. I try making eye contact with my bus driver through that front mirror. Maybe he'll see my distress. Maybe he'll pull over and I can release my load at a Burger King. I ended up squatting over my paper lunch bag and taking a massive dump in it, all while sobbing and staring at the back of the girl who sat in the seat in front of me. Afterwards, I was just so flustered. I buckled the bag next to me for the rest of the ride. It was a low point in my life. A few months later, I did it again. Some kid in the back of the bus was being given grief by this bully. My school district didn't really do crap about bullies. The kid being bullied was just sitting 3 to a seat with his legs in the aisle, and the bully was sitting by one of his friends, in the aisle across from the kid he was messing with. The bully decided to start pushing the kid's leg. Before it was verbal, but now it was physical. The kid told the bully to stop. Bully mocked him and did it again. Kid then punched the bully in the nose, breaking it and causing a huge amount of blood to leak from it. By now, the bus had stopped at some bus stop. The kid gets his stuff, gets off at the bus stop that's a few ahead of his, and the second he's off, he starts running and going a different route to his house. The bus driver had been unaware of what had happened until someone yelled for the bus driver to call someone because the bully's nose wouldn't stop bleeding. So he calls someone while the bully is calling his mum, crying. So we get the police to show up. His mum and other kids have called their parents because at this point we've been at a standstill for more than 30 minutes. They call the principal too. We don't know who called the police, so they, along with the principal, are asking who did it and getting us to confess. And we're all like, we don't know. Of course we did know, but why would we tell on our hero? The principal and police are talking and they think the kid is still on the bus. We then say, oh, he got off. We don't know where he went or who he was. The principal and police look at the bus driver who shrugs because she didn't realize what was going on until it was too late. We spent 2 hours on that hot bus because of it, but I couldn't even be mad. My middle school bus was wild. The bus driver when I was in early grade school was named Ross. My neighborhood was the first stop in the mornings, so we were always the first people on the bus. One day he picked us up and somehow forgot all about the other stops. There were like 10 to 15 total. He gets like a block away from the school when he realizes there's only like 8 kids on the bus. He turns around and goes back through every stop, but all the other kids have already gotten rides with their parents because we were over 30 minutes behind schedule by this point. I ended up being almost an hour late to school. As a kid, it was hilarious. As an adult, I think Ross was on something. One time, my friend pushed me out of the seat and I fell and face-planted on a guy's eggplant. This is almost 30 years ago. My buddy and me were very big Star Wars fans and this was our first year taking the bus. We'd sit behind the driver every day and whenever his little stop sign activated, a small red light on his dashboard would flash. Every time this happened, one of us would reach past him, pointing and yell, "What's that flashing?" reliving the scene from Episode 5 in the Millennium Falcon. We did this every day for months. The driver never asked why or asked us to stop. I'm sure he's long dead and often wondered what the F was wrong with us. That's pretty harmless as far as the crap that kids can get up to on the bus goes. A lot of drivers back then would honestly just let anything fly, including fights, as long as the kids aren't directly targeting the drivers themselves. Leroy. High school. We named our bus driver Leroy. 1996, before Leroy Jenkins. This ride-or-die mother effer would not speak. He pulled up in his bus, opened the swing arm, glared at us, waited and closed the swing arm. Then waited. Once we were seated, he would drive. Not a word, ever. We drank, we smoked, and we hooked up. What finally broke him was a fight. Leroy pulled his bus over and got out of his seat. Standing in the aisle, Leroy said, "That's enough." The entire bus went silent. Leroy was the frickin' man. When some goth kids wrote pig and then the B word on the back of my book bag, I walked around middle school that entire day without knowing. What they didn't realize is I couldn't afford a new book bag. I had to have someone draw a puppy over it. I was in 5th grade going home from school. One of the kids in the year below me decided once he got off the bus that it would be a great idea to moon all the kids still on. Well, he pulled his pants down too far and everyone got an eyeful of his junk, including the bus driver. He got in big trouble with the school and got teased for ages after that. In grade school, a girl with really long hair was sitting next to an open window and her hair got snagged by a tree limb. It ripped a chunk of scalp off her head about the size of a tennis ball. The middle schoolers would always ride the bus at the same time as the high schoolers did in the mornings. Second day of 8th grade and 2 high schoolers in the back had brought their guitars on the bus with them and played the entire way. The bus getting pulled over and the driver getting arrested. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.